Confused by the favor and hatred of parties, his character in history wavers. Schiller says this about Wallenstein, the general of the 30 Years' War. But you could slap that line right on Alexander the Great, and it would stick just as well, wouldn't it? Because, see, here's the thing. Even in antiquity, people can't really agree on who Alexander is. We got Diodorus writing his history. He's kind of starstruck. He says, quote, "In a short time, this king accomplished great deeds. Thanks to his cleverness and bravery, he surpassed all the kings of whom memory knows." End quote. 12 years, folks. In 12 years, Alexander conquers Greece, Persia, Egypt. He burns across the map like wildfire. He's swallowing nearly the whole known world, and in the aftermath, people start whispering, he's a hero, maybe even a demigod. But when we flip the coin here, we got people like Seneca, the Roman Stoic philosopher. Seneca looks at the same guy and he sees a monster. He calls Alexander a man consumed by destruction, a beast in human form. Seneca says, quote, "Do you call this sanity, to topple states his father had already broken, to carry war across the globe, never stopping, never sated? He kills like an animal that craves blood long after its hunger is gone." End quote. So, what do we do with that? Again, even the ancients can't make up their minds, it seems. And that tension, that tug of war between glory and atrocity, carries forward through every age that's tried to grapple with Alexander. I mean, it's only human, it's almost our natural instinct to make value judgments about events and people in the past, isn't it? Especially charismatic yet ambivalent figures like Alexander. They are the most interesting, aren't they? But why are we so eager to judge these people anyways, one might ask? I believe it's because figures like Alexander force us to look at the limits of human experience, of ideas like morality, power, ambition, violence, and greatness. And in doing so, we get a sense of how we think about those concepts in our own lifetime, isn't it? We learn where we stand in comparison, and what's most important, I think, is where we might want to go or not go in the future. When we jump to 1833, Johann Gustav Droysen writes Alexander the Great, and suddenly Alexander is no longer just a man but a vehicle of history. He's the hinge of civilizations, bringing East and West together. He's setting the stage for Christianity, progress, enlightenment. Droysen has Alexander become the Hegelian superhero, the Übermensch, as Hegel refers to it, which translates to superhuman, a historical figure who kicks off a new era, or creates a new order basically. And in doing so, that person might overcome existing or traditional morals. The underlying logic here is that if the ends are noble, then the means can be justified. Now, whether you want to view Alexander as this Hegelian superhero and by the end of this episode grant him the get out of jail free card because you believe he pursued a greater cause and his actions are therefore justifiable, this I will leave up to you, of course. You know, I wonder if Alexander deep inside genuinely considered himself as that extraordinary, that Übermensch, superhuman type figure. Considering the heritage attributed to him, all that mythology around this person and all that we know about his life and achievements, he certainly must have thought so, right? Kind of in the same vein as Droysen, you get William Woodthorpe Tarn, writing in the age of empire. Surprise, surprise, Alexander now looks a lot like an enlightened imperialist, almost a prototype for the British Empire, I would say. But not every era sees him that way. When you look at Nazi Germany, for example, Fritz Schachermayer twists Alexander into a demonic titan, a kind of superhuman force of nature that, depending on how you squint, looks a little too much like Hitler. After the war, when skepticism reigns, historians recoil from those sweeping claims. They go small, pragmatic, minimalist even. See, for example, Adriotti, Hampel, Badian, and Laufer, they break Alexander into pieces, specific problems, smaller interpretations, piecemeal history. Yet again, even all those historians can't resist the value judgments here. It seems Alexander's personality is simply very much inviting these kinds of judgments, isn't it? But then again, and this is sort of an omnipresent dilemma of all scientific history writing, I guess. While value judgments are indeed problematic, they are also unavoidable, because as soon as you go ahead and choose which facts to look at, which sources to prioritize, or how to frame events, you've already embedded value judgments, right? Also, remember, we're largely predetermined by our cultural upbringing and the area we are living in. A Greek Macedonian historian might look at Alexander from a whole different perspective than a Persian historian might do, right? I'm afraid we just have to accept these things as given, and accept that no matter what history we're dealing with, there can never be that one golden approach to it. Let's fast forward here to our own postmodern era, where we see Alexander's image fragmenting again. You got one scholar painting him as a destructive psychopath, another sees him as a Dionysian reveler, drunk on wine and conquest. Still others read him as a symbol in the eternal clash between Orient and Occident. So, still the same dividedness and judgments, right, to this day. And when you think about it, each interpretation really says as much about the scholar and their world as it does about Alexander himself, right? Which brings us to the real question here. Can any historian escape this gravitational pull of projection? Can anyone see Alexander for who he was rather than who they need him to be? We'll try to answer that question by turning to two anchors. The first one will be Homer's Iliad, centuries before Alexander's birth, and Arrian's Anabasis, written nearly 500 years after his death. So why those two? Because Homer tells us about Alexander's mental world. The Iliad is the storybook of the Greeks. Every educated boy reads it, lives in it, breathes it. It's really the code of its heroes to be the best and surpass all others, which is carved into Alexander's soul, I think. Macedonia, his homeland, is a place where life still echoes with Homeric rhythms. You got competition, honor, vengeance, glory. Those are the things that shape him. They drive him. And then Arrian, well, Arrian is the map, if you will, the narrative, the sober reconstruction of what Alexander actually did. Together, Homer and Arrian become the twin poles of this inquiry, one probing the king's inner drives, the other kind of charting the outer course of events. So, clearly, the problem with Alexander isn't just who he was, it's how we even know about him. Because the stories we have, the big narratives, don't come from his time. They are written centuries later. By the middle of the 1st century BC, 300 years after Alexander dies, Diodorus writes the Historical Library, Book 17. Then another century passes, and Curtius Rufus produces his Histories of Alexander. And then again to the early 2nd century AD, and now we're in the hands of Plutarch and Arrian. So these guys are our main storytellers. They are the ones who bring Alexander to life for us. But think about it. They are writing about a man who lived hundreds of years before them. They never saw him, never marched with him, never smelt the dust of his battles. So, what are they doing? They're leaning on older works, books written in Alexander's own day or shortly after his death. And the tragic thing about that is those works, the ones closest to the action, are almost completely lost. Imagine the treasure we'd have if we still possessed the writings of Callisthenes, Alexander's official chronicler, the guy who marches right there beside him into Persia, or Clytachus, who digs into battlefield reports and produces a vivid, wildly popular account, or the memoirs of men who actually served under him, right? You got Nearchus, the fleet commander, or Ptolemy, who fights beside Alexander and later rules Egypt as a king. Unfortunately, we don't have those. What we have is echoes. And those echoes, they're already distorted. From the very beginning, many accounts lean into the miraculous, the superhuman. They paint Alexander as more than a man, a demigod, a figure walking the boundary between human and divine. It is really that Vulgate tradition, rooted in Clytarchus and handed down by Diodorus Curtius and even Plutarch, which is full of these fabulous tales. You know, the kind of stuff that makes for great storytelling, but really shaky history, rather. Then there's the other line. You got Ptolemy, Aristobulus, guys who actually served under Alexander and who prefer a straighter version of events, more sober, less miraculous. Arrian, centuries later, chooses their path. He likes the clarity, the simplicity, the sense of realism, and modern historians looking back often give Arrian the edge. Not because he's perfect, but because his sources just seem steadier. That's why when scholars today try to peel back the layers, when they sift through the fabulous and the factual, Arrian usually comes out on top. Reliable? More often than not, yes, but far from flawless. Even Arrian needs correction here and there, supplementation, filling in from elsewhere. So here we are, trying to reconstruct the life of Alexander the Great with sources written long after the fact, based on books that no longer exist, filtered through traditions that are already making him into something more or less than human. It's like trying to see a man through a hall of mirrors. Which reflection do you trust? Which distortion tells you the most truth? That's the historian's dilemma, and it starts before you even get to Alexander the man. It begins with the voices telling his story. And so, our search for Alexander begins not through modern psychoanalysis or political allegory, but through the lens of the world he himself knew. A world where Achilles still looms large, and where The dream of surpassing all others fuels a young Macedonian who sets out to conquer the earth. It's around July 356 BC, and the palace of Pella, a child is born, Alexander. He is the legitimate son of King Philip II of Macedon and Olympias, a Molossian princess from Epirus. The Macedonians, they're tied by their language and culture to the broader Greek world. They live north of Mount Olympus in Pieria. Their ancient center is Aegae, the burial ground of their kings. Their rulers, they call themselves Basileus. Unlike the other Greek rulers, they trace their descent to the hero Heracles, which is the Greek name. The Roman name is Hercules, son of Zeus. But kingship in Macedon isn't secure or anything. There's no fixed line of succession here. The throne belongs to whoever can seize and hold it, whoever is strong enough, skilled enough, charismatic enough. To be a king, it isn't enough to be royal by blood. You must be a warrior, a general, a politician, a hunter, and a drinker. You must keep nobles close, and you must keep the warriors loyal. Without the loyalty of your men, you're screwed, right? You're basically dead. And because Macedonian kings marry many wives, which some marriages are struck for political reasons, like securing alliances, the pool of potential heirs is large. As you can imagine, that leads to a lot of rivalries among the potential heirs and their mothers. Unlike the Greek polis to the south, life in Macedonia is much more tribal. It's both agricultural and martial. You got fertile farmland sustaining crops, but you also have herds of cattle and horses, and of course, vast forests filled with bulls and wolves. So, that's also why hunting here is not a pastime. Hunting is a test of courage for the Macedonians, a road to honor. They're also constantly involved in war. Skirmishes with Illyrians, Thracians, or rival clans are as routine as the seasons. And in this world, a man who has not yet hunted a boar or killed in war is no man at all. What kind of man comes out of a world where a boy isn't a man until he's killed a boar? I mean, who raises a son with peace in mind in a rough place like this, right? It's almost as if Alexander is determined to be a product of violence before his story even starts. In Macedonia, social life revolves around the drinking banquet, the so-called symposium. And unlike the refined, ritualized versions in Athens, Macedonian feasts, they tend to spiral into chaos. Wine is drunk unmixed and in quantities the Greeks call barbaric. When we talk about Alexander, we're constantly moving on that blurred line between myth and memory. What's real and what's been added, right? But hey, if the wine never gets watered down, and do the stories that revolve around a man with a raw background like this, it is in this violent, hard-drinking, honor-obsessed world that the Argead dynasty proves its endurance. So, from their base around the Thermic Gulf, they expand northward and eastward. They're binding other highland tribes like the Elymiotes, Orestae, Lyncestae, Tymphaeans, Pelagonians, and yeah, I know I'm butchering all these names, but quickly a distinction emerges here. You got Lower Macedonia near the Gulf, Upper Macedonia in the Highland cantons, and since the 6th century, the Argeads pushed to build and hold that larger realm. But their rule is never secure. Every success is matched by a setback, and you got internal feuds, rival dynasties, rebellious chiefs, and external enemies, the Illyrians to the northwest, Thracians to the northeast, Greek city-states to the south. All of these guys are pressing constantly. I mean, how long can such a patchwork of loyalties really hold when every clan has a prince and a grudge, right? Also, when your neighbors are raiders to the north and creditors to the south, which one do you feel more? The Greeks are colonizing, especially the Athenians. They settle the choicest coastal cities, controlling farmland and maritime trade. Sometimes trade ties emerge, timber for ships, for example, but the Greeks also loom as dangerous overlords. What would you do in the midst of all of this? Do you trade timber or trade blows? In the early 4th century, Philip, Alexander's father, born in 383 or 382, again, we are not sure, experiences this instability firsthand. His father, Amyntas III, Alexander's grandfather, holds the throne with an iron fist. Philip's elder brother, Alexander II, loses control to Thebes and is assassinated. Philip himself spends years as a hostage in Thebes. His other brother, Perdiccas, struggles against Athenian power. In 359, Illyrians annihilate the Macedonian king and 4,000 warriors. Philip inherits the wreckage, and at first as a regent for his nephew, but then Philip learns the lesson of Macedonian history well. Survival requires dominance. There's no safe middle ground. To be free, you must make others unfree. It's almost mafia logic, isn't it? You're either the predator or the prey. Maybe it's just how the world back then worked, right? Or is it still the same today? I mean, when you think about it, is there really any freedom here that isn't bought by someone else's chains? In any case, it is a worldview as stark as it is brutal, and Philip embraces it. His policy is supremacy, inside and outside Macedonia. And by the way, his attitude thereafter shouldn't really surprise us. I mean, chances are, if you had ever been taken hostage, you wouldn't stop planning your enemy's captivity ever, would you? He rebuilds everything, drawing on precedents from predecessors like Archelaus. He modernizes the kingdom. Philip founds cities, exploits resources, timber, metals, farmland, and he also imports Greek culture, like language, education, and civic life. Most importantly, however, Philip reforms the army, cavalry, along the elite arm of Macedon, is reorganized as the king's companions, the so-called hetairoi. And to balance them, Philip raises the infantry's rank, pes hetairoi, foot companions armed with sarissas, which are 5-meter-long pikes, and these guys are fighting in tight formations. Philip's really perfecting combined arms warfare. You got cavalry, infantry, archers, slingers, engineers, mercenaries, siegecraft, and it's all integrated into one system. He professionalizes his army, giving soldiers hereditary land grants to free them for full-time service. And it kind of feels like a startup for conquest at this point, doesn't it? What we see here is that magnificent military machine in the making, that fine-tuned war engine that Alexander will eventually inherit, each cog meshing perfectly, the cavalry wheel grinding with the phalanx teeth, mercenary specialists functioning as gears and levers. What Philip also does is creating bonds of loyalty. The sons of nobles become paides basilikoi, royal pages trained in intellect, politics, and war under the king's eye. These guys serve him personally and bind their families to the throne in that way. At Pella, his splendid court becomes the nexus of Macedonian noble life. Through campaigns, councils, and feasts, Philip ties the elite to him. Trusted generals like Antipater and Parmenion rise as his closest collaborators. This is when his regime stabilizes. And it all makes sense, right, when you think about it? Because what is it that binds these guys tighter? Is it philosophy lessons or sharing blood on a boar spear while hunting, right? Or is it both, maybe? Sounds almost like some sort of summer camp, doesn't it? A bunch of young guys having a great time at the king's court, private classes, going hunting in the woods, great food and wine. I mean, sign me up. Meanwhile, Olympias, Philip's fourth wife, provides him with Alexander. Philip has 7 wives, but only 2 sons survive, Aridaeus, mentally disabled, and Alexander. That makes Alexander the heir. He grows up with the sons of noble families, he's trained in arms, sports, and, of course, hunting. He absorbs Greek education, he's memorizing Homer. I mean, why not memorize the entire Iliad, right? That's just what these people do, I guess. So, from an early age, we see that Alexander is trained to always be the best and try to surpass the others, right? That heroic code of the Iliad. Just like his idol, Achilles, he bonds with his companion Hephaestion, which is similar to Patroclus binding with Achilles. At 14, Alexander and his circle study under Aristotle at Mieza. Aristotle deepens Alexander's Homeric learning. He gives him an annotated Iliad, which he keeps under his pillow alongside a dagger. What does a boy dream of when a dagger and the Iliad share his pillow? And if Achilles is your North Star, where else can the compass point but war? Again, we see Alexander's path being paved by his upbringing. It's almost as if he doesn't even have a choice, right? Alexander studies tragedy, history, poetry, geography. He's reading Herodotus, Pindar, and all the tragedians. He's also drilled in ethics, and that's possibly where he picks up the idea of pothos, or pathos, which means something like yearning, that heroic pursuit of glory. Pothos is one of those words, one of those concepts that no matter how you try to translate it, you're not really giving it any justice. Pothos is really hard to capture in a single English term. At its core, it means something like yearning, longing, desire, even, but not just any desire. It's that aching pull towards something distant, almost unreachable. For Alexander, Pothos becomes a defining feature of his character, and we'll read about it again and again over the course of his lifetime, especially with Ariane, who uses it to explain why Alexander pushes forward when logic, strategy, or even survival says to stop. Ariane writes, quote, "As for the exact thoughts in Alexander's mind, I am neither able nor concerned to guess them, but this I think I can state, that nothing common or mean would have been his intention. He would not have remained content with any of his conquests, not even if he had added the British Isles to Europe. He would always have searched beyond for something unknown, and if there had been no other competition, he would have competed against himself." End quote. I think Arian really hits the nail on its head here. I mean, constantly competing against yourself when there's no other competition or challenge left, that is, I believe, as accurate as it gets when we're trying to define what Pothos really is. Now, some of you might know retired US Navy SEAL ultramarathon runner, endurance athlete, and motivational speaker David Goggins. He's got that same relentless drive that Alexander seems to have had, you know. Goggins' callous the mind philosophy of deliberately seeking discomfort and pain as a path to mastery and inner strength. I genuinely believe that Alexander had that same mentality. Again, just speculating, I'm not a historian, but I guess that's just one of the benefits you get for being an amateur, a non-professional history enthusiast, I guess. You get to step outside the scientific framework a bit and make your own little comparisons and alternate history discussions, right? Anyways, by the age of 16, Alexander is already acting. While his father campaigns, he governs Macedonia. Alexander negotiates with Persian envoys. He leads an expedition against Thracians. He is immersed in Philip's transformation of Macedon from pawn to power. He sees new cities, new mines, new farmland seized. He sees Greek cities like Amphipolis, Potidaea, Olynthos fall to his father. He watches his father master Thessaly and become Archon of the Thessalian League, intervene in Delphi, manipulate rivalries among Greek polis. By the year 338, Athens and Thebes rally against him. At Chaeronea, Philip commands, but it is Alexander, who's, by the way, only 18 years old here, who leads the cavalry charge against them and smashes the Theban sacred band. 30,000 men clash. Macedonian tactics prevail, and the elite corps of Thebes dies to a man. Macedon stands supreme. Can we consider all of this still apprenticeship, or is this already Alexander's audition to his future role as Macedon king? It really feels like the turning point from student to actor, doesn't it? I mean, you're already governing, negotiating, leading expeditions, and the cavalry, while Dad's out there campaigning. Philip goes ahead and binds Greece into the League of Corinth, and he's cloaking his dominance in the language of what he calls common peace. Every state, save Sparta, joins. Question is, of course, do the Greeks see a peacemaker in Philip or a warden with the keys in his pocket? Also, if peace has to be organized at spear point, is it peace at all? The truth of the matter is, The Synhedrion gives the illusion of Greek self-rule, but real power lies with Philip as the hegemon. Again, who really votes when the hegemon chairs the meeting, right? Interestingly, the League of Corinth has a built-in mission, which is war against Persia. The enemy is ideal, revenge for Xerxes' invasion. You left our cities in ruins, now we're coming to destroy yours, is the motivation here, I guess. And while we're at it, on the way we'll also like to liberate the Greek cities in Asia Minor. Oh yeah, and of course Persia itself is huge and rich, right? Also militarily brittle. It's rocked by rebellions, crises, weak kings, so we might as well take this opportunity. In 337, the Synhedrion approves war. In 336, Parmenion and Attalus cross into Asia Minor with an advance force. But then, in the autumn of that same year, Philip is assassinated at Ægæ, stabbed at his daughter's wedding. The assassin is killed immediately. Was it personal vengeance or conspiracy? Did Olympia scheme? Did Alexander? The rumors swirl then and now. There is this everlasting conspiracy theory around Alexander having his own father killed in the aftermath of a seemingly irreconcilable rift that had arisen in their relationship barely a year earlier. In the spring or summer of 337, Philip takes another wife, Cleopatra Eurydice, the niece of Attalus. By the way, this is not the Cleopatra that Julius Caesar fooled around with and that became Mark Antony's girlfriend. Cleopatra is just a common Macedonian name at the time. And although she's Philip's seventh wife, Cleopatra Eurydice is special because she stems from the closer Macedonian nobility. Philip's other wives appear foreign in comparison to her. Also because Philip's and Olympia's shared daughter's name happens to be Cleopatra too. Hereafter I will refer to Philip's new wife by her second name, Eurydice, instead, to not create any more unnecessary confusion. I mean, these ancient family constellations tend to be confusing as it is, right? Anyways, while they're all assembled at the wedding feast, the already somewhat volatile and uneasy relationship between Alexander and his father takes a possibly irreparable hit. Historian Peter Green depicts the situation like this, quote, "The wedding feast, as might be expected, was a tense occasion. When Alexander walked in and took the place of honor which was his by right, opposite his father, he said to Philip, 'When my mother remarries, I'll invite you to her wedding.' Not a remark calculated to improve anyone's temper. During the evening, in true Macedonian fashion, a great deal of wine was drunk. At least Attalus rose, swaying, and proposed a toast, in which he called upon the Macedonians to ask of the gods that from Philip and Cleopatra, meaning Eurydice, there might be born a legitimate successor to the kingdom. The truth was finally out and made public in a way which no one, least of all Alexander, could ignore. Infuriated, the crown prince sprang to his feet. 'Are you calling me a bastard?' he shouted, and flung his goblet in Attalus's face. Attalus retaliated in kind. Philip, more drunk than either of them, drew his sword and lurched forward, bent on cutting down not Attalus, who had, after all, insulted his son and heir, but Alexander himself, a revealing detail. However, the drink he had taken, combined with his lame leg, made Philip trip over a stool and crash headlong to the floor. "That gentleman," said Alexander, with icy contempt, "is the man who's been preparing to cross from Europe into Asia, and he can't even make it from one couch to the next." End quote. All right, let's take a moment to unravel all of this. How must Alexander have felt in the aftermath of this? I mean, how would you have felt? You'd probably feel the ground shift under your feet, right? Imagine you had always been the crown prince, the undisputed heir. Your mother, Olympias, holds the highest position among Philip's many wives because she's the mother of the heir. But then your dad, Philip, marries again Eurydice, the niece of the powerful general Attalus. For you, Alexander, this is more than an insult, isn't it? It's a threat. If Eurydice produces a son, Alexander's, so your, claim to the throne suddenly looks shaky. Your honor is wounded, and so is your mother's. It seems only natural that, in fury, both mother and son leave the Macedonian court. They retreat to Olympia's homeland in Epirus. The royal family of Molossia welcomes them home. The following year, reconciliation comes. It's brokered by a Greek intermediary. Father and son make peace, at least outwardly, but the wound never really heals, it seems. Beneath the smiles, the relationship is scarred, poisoned by politics and mistrust. And then comes the shock, autumn of 336, at Aegae, during the grand wedding of Philip's daughter Cleopatra to her uncle Alexander of Epirus, Olympias's brother. King Philip is struck down. A bodyguard named Pausanias stabs him to death in the theater in front of the assembled crowd. Now we've got 4 different primary sources describing this event, of which I like Diodorus' account the most, because it's the most vivid and detailed of them. I shortened his descriptions here and there, and I tried to focus on the most important passages. In Charles Henry Oldfather's excellent translation, Diodorus describes Philip's assassination, and it goes something like this, quote, "When Philip had made ready for the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra to Alexander of Epirus, he celebrated the marriage with great magnificence at Aegae. As he walked in the theater between his son Alexander and the bridegroom, wearing a white cloak and unattended by his bodyguards, Pausanias, one of the 7 bodyguards, ran up to him and struck him down with a dagger. After killing him, Pausanias ran to escape, but as he fled to the gates, his foot caught in a vine and he fell, and the bodyguards killed him. Some suspected that Olympias was privy to the plot, and also Alexander, who was irritated at his father's marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice. But others say that Pausanias, being wronged by Attalus and not receiving justice from Philip, plotted revenge against the king himself. Others say that it was by the contrivance of the Persians that Pausanias was induced to commit the murder, because Philip had declared that he would wage war against them." End quote. So clearly, the one part where everyone agrees on is the assassin is Pausanias, but why he kills and whether he acts alone, that's where the stories diverge. Diodorus says, Pausanias lashes out because of a personal grievance. He's been humiliated, ignored, mistreated, and this is his revenge. A straightforward motive, it seems, right? But then Justin, a century later, tells a darker tale. He hints that Olympias and Alexander may have had a hand in it, right? That it isn't just a bodyguard's vendetta, it's maybe a dynastic coup. Plutarch is cagier. He repeats the revenge story, but admits the suspicions. He doesn't clear Alexander, but he doesn't condemn him either. So Plutarch is sort of in between. And then there's Arrian, or our most sober source, writing 400 years later. He's confirming the basics, Ege, the wedding, the murder, but skips the gossip. He avoids speculation and keeps it bare. So what do you do with that? The official explanation is plausible enough. Pausanias kills out of wounded honor, a personal grievance long ignored. It makes sense, right? It is said that Pausanias had been sexually assaulted by Attalus' men, and Philip had refused to punish Attalus, likely for political reasons. Remember, Attalus had just become his in-law and key ally. But then again, the insult dated back years. You could ask why Pausanias would keep quiet for all those years and nurse this grievance, right? Why strike now, at this moment, at this wedding? The assassin is cut down on the spot. No chance to question him whatsoever. Convenient, isn't it? The Persian involvement that Diodorus mentions remains not more than a rumor. There's no direct evidence of Persian agents being involved, especially considering the fact that Philip is killed in October 336, just months after Darius took power, and the Persian court was still in turmoil at that time. So this looks more like Macedonian propaganda to me. Would you agree? Then Olympias is suspected right after the murder, but she had been far away, remember? She had fled to her homeland after the insult at Philip's and Eurydice's wedding. Seems rather unlikely to me that she could have had a hand in it for that reason alone. Now we're basically left with Alexander himself as the remaining suspect. The transition of power is suspiciously seamless. The Macedonian army proclaims Alexander king without hesitation. Rivals are removed swiftly. If you think about it, Alexander's motive seems compelling. I mean, Philip is only in his mid-40s. He might have reigned decades longer, right? Long enough for new hair to rise. Long enough to push Alexander aside, leave him nothing more than the bastard of the wild Epirot woman, right? This moment is what divides opinion then and now. Is Alexander a dutiful son, swept along by fate, or is he a calculating patricide, clearing his path to the throne? The sources are fragmentary. They contradict each other. They're full of gaps. You can make a case either way if you wanted to. And that's the problem. If you come to Alexander already critical, you'll see the assassin's dagger in his hand. If you come as an admirer, you'll dismiss the suspicion as slander. The truth is lost in the theater at Ege, and we're left with questions that can never be resolved. What is certain is this: Philip is dead, Alexander, age 20, is proclaimed king. Macedon, Greece, and the war against Persia, all of it is his. Macedonia. It's the year 336 BC, BCE. The old King Philip is dead, and the throne trembles. Into this vacuum steps his 20-year-old son Alexander. Dad just got whacked in front of his eyes. Assuming that Alexander was, in fact, not involved in Philip's assassination, this must have been traumatizing beyond belief, right? God forbid, but could you imagine one of your parents being murdered in front of your eyes? I don't even want to go there. I wonder what kind of person emerges from this kind of background. I mean, this is the Bruce Wayne narrative, isn't it? This is the origin story of Batman. And like Batman, Alexander might have been, at least in part, driven by a desire for revenge from thereafter. Now, if we want to believe in the rumors around Persian King Darius having Philip killed, it appears only natural that Alexander's hatred, his bloodlust, that longing for revenge must have been directed towards Persia, right? But again, this could very well be just propaganda. I mean, from a political standpoint, it would make a lot of sense if you're trying to consolidate your newly acquired power and you want to unify the troops, gain their favor for an extensive campaign eastward. I mean, what better way than pointing fingers at a common enemy? Why not put all the blame on the Persians, right? In any case, Alexander buries his father at Egi. It's the sacred resting place of all the Macedonian kings. The burial is carried out with all the lavish pomp and cold precision. Then he begins to purge. 2 Lyncestian nobles, their possible claimants of the throne from Upper Macedonia, are dragged out, condemned as conspirators, and executed. His cousin Amyntas, once regent, follows. Even Attalus, the powerful general stationed far off in Asia Minor, suddenly meets the quiet blade of an assassin. Alexander is sending a message here. There will be no rivals whatsoever. Alexander secures the throne and he moves on. By 336, he sweeps down into Thessaly and he compels them to hail him as their archon, actually. In Corinth, he takes up his father's mantle as hegemon of the Greek League. One by one, the old pillars of Philip's power accept his son, but still the stability here is a mirage. In spring of 335, so not even a year later, word arrives that Illyrians and Thracians are plotting an invasion. Alexander does not wait for them to come. He hurls his army north, smashing through the jagged spine of the Balkans. He's driving as far as the Danube itself. He even crosses it, which is, of course, part military demonstration, part personal compulsion, I guess. That pathos playing out again. That insatiable longing to go further simply because there is a beyond. Then he wheels west. He's falling upon the Illyrians in their mountain fastness and brutal terrain. He crushes them. His victory seems complete, but just as the dust settles, there's a rumor going around across Greece that Alexander is dead. Thebes rises. They call for all the Greeks to join their cause. Even Athens begins to stir. And the Persians, of course, they see the opportunity, right? They start to fund the rebellion that's brewing up there. And Alexander reacts with the speed that he's very well known for. He marches from Illyria to central Greece so fast, in fact, that man will later argue it's impossible. In merely days, he isolates Thebes, and then he strikes. Thebes becomes a cautionary tale. Over 6,000 men are slaughtered. The survivors are sold as slaves. The walls are torn down stone by stone. only the house of Pindar, the poet Alexander Reverse, stands untouched among the ruins. In a world where there's no internet, no globalization, no instant speed messaging, from time to time you gotta send a message to remind people of who's in charge here. And the message is very clear. If you resist, you're going to be annihilated. And yet, even here, the young king shows restraint when it serves his ends. Athens, it is complicit, but he spares it. And why would Alexander spare the city? Because the city's prestige is useful, and the city's fleet is indispensable. The idea is to honor Athens, and the whole Greek will take notice, right? He even goes ahead and reaffirms the Corinthian League. With Illyrians cowed and Thracians humbled and Greece stunned into silence, Alexander has now got the time to turn to the great prize that consumed his father's dreams, Persia. It's spring 334 BCE. Alexander crosses the Hellespont with 37,000 troops. He leaves old Antipater to guard Europe. Parmenion, Philip's seasoned general, rides at his side. The core of the army is made up of the Peshetiroi and Hypaspists. Those are battle-hardened infantry who have marched under him since youth. And then you got the elite Hetairoi cavalry, his personal companions. They glitter in bronze and scarlet. You've got Greek hoplites, Thracian skirmishers, Illyrian spearmen, engineers, scribes, even philosophers trail in his wake. I want to add that the estimated army size Alexander has supposedly taken across the Hellespont actually seems plausible by modern-day estimates. I say this because we're so used to ancient sources exaggerating numbers for different reasons, but in Alexander's case, feeding around 37,000 troops across the Hellespont could actually have been manageable, especially if we consider the 160 ships Arrian says he used. So Macedonia could probably field above 25,000 seasoned troops after Philip's reforms. Alexander also had Greek allied contingents from the League of Corinth, so that's another 7,000 to 10,000 maybe men. And it's estimated that he left about 12,000 men behind in Macedonia to secure Greece. So, which again fits very well with the total available pool of about 50,000 men. Those numbers are generally considered credible and logistically realistic by historians like Robin Lane Fox, Nicholas G. L. Hammond, John F. C. Fuller, and Albert B. Bosworth. So the dimensions here seem fairly accurate. Or let's say they're probably at least not grossly exaggerated, making it one of those rare cases where ancient troop numbers seem logistically and politically plausible. What Alexander doesn't have is a navy. The fleet is borrowed from uneasy Greek allies. And if Persia controls the sea, they could cut Alexander's lifetime at any moment. So Alexander is under pressure to act. He must strike fast and hard before fear or famine can strangle him. And as he steps onto Asian soil, he performs a number of mythical rituals. At Elaios, he sacrifices to Protesilaus, first Greek to fall at Troy. In mid-channel, he offers libations to Poseidon, the god of the sea, as Xerxes once did before him. So near the shore, he hurls a spear into the land, again, a symbolic act of claiming Asia. And again, he leaves the shore in full armor, just as Protesilaus once did. At Troy itself, which is by that time little more than a ruin, he lays a wreath on Achilles' tomb. Hephaestion honors Patroclus. We see Alexander leaving his own armor to Athena, the goddess, and takes up ancient arms which are said to be relics of the Trojan War. He even offers atonement to the ghost of Priam, whom his own ancestor Neoptolemus had butchered at an altar. So, from a modern day perspective, what we see is Alexander doing a bunch of weird mythical stuff at different sites in Asia Minor. Question is, why even bother, right? Why seemingly waste time with all of these rituals and not just keep marching toward Persia as quickly as possible? This is where we gotta remind ourselves of how important symbolic communication was all throughout the ancient world, the Middle Ages, and even today. I mean, there's no internet, no TVs, no radio, nothing back then. Instead, as a ruler, you gotta be performing these sorts of ceremonies in public from time to time to legitimize your rule, remind friends and foes of who you are, or in this case, legitimize conquest. In Asia Minor, Alexander does this in a few different ways. You got the mythological aspect, when he honors Achilles at Troy, symbolically casting himself as the new Homeric hero, continuing the Greeks' legendary war against Asia, and it's always been Greece against Asia. So again, this links his campaign to the Trojan War, which was considered the archetypical East-West conflict in Greek cultural memory at the time. So what he basically does is he's framing his campaign as the continuation of the Homeric epic. He's simply fulfilling his heroic destiny, right? I mean, this campaign was inevitable. Alexander's just following in Achilles' footsteps, isn't he? What he's also doing is he's laying the foundation for the cult revolving around his own person. Alexander as the hero god. Alexander's carrying around sacred relics, sort of elevating him to semi-divine status. Along with all of this, we gotta look at religious legitimacy. When Alexander sacrifices to Greek gods like Athena, Zeus, and local deities also, this makes him appear as the pious and God-favored leader and not as an impious invader. And this is very important. He's also consulting omens and seers before battles, and this demonstrates that he seeks and also receives divine sanction for each step that he's taken. We gotta remember that these ancient audiences believed that success depended heavily on divine favor, so these ceremonies pre-framed victory as inevitable. In this way, not only would you legitimize your rule religiously, right? I mean, you are the chosen and favored by the gods, but also this must be a great morale booster for your men, right? They're going into battle knowing that they're the ones supported by the gods, and their victory has already been determined. Then there's also the aspect of cultural diplomacy. What I mean by that is respecting local gods and customs. Especially in Anatolia and later in Egypt, Babylon, etc., Alexander presents himself as chosen by both Greek and local deities. Gotta win over the locals too, right? This must have helped to pacify conquered peoples and prepare them to accept Alexander's authority. You're sort of blending Greek and local traditions into a broader imperial identity. So Alexander's obviously already planning for the long game. You can't just conquer. You also need to establish peace in the newly acquired regions. And what better way than saying, see, look, our cultures and traditions are similar and they go together so well. Meanwhile, the Persians wait at the Granicus River. Their cavalry lines up at the riverbanks. Their army is twice the number, the elite of the satrapal forces. 20,000 Greek mercenaries stand behind them. We see Greeks fighting Greeks for money. From a military tactics standpoint, aligning your cavalry across the riverbanks doesn't make a lot of sense. That kind of nullifies the cavalry's greatest advantage, which is mobility, right? Alexander charges, and notably across the river, which again is unusual and very risky, truly not something one would expect. Also, Alexander's attacking them late in the day as opposed to early morning. I imagine that normally you would sleep the night, wake up refreshed, and then go to battle. But not with Alexander. He likes to break the rules and gamble. He throws himself in the thickest fighting, as he had at Carionia, smashing through where the enemy is strongest, and he's really reckless and insane. But it works. The Persian cavalry breaks. The mercenaries are surrounded, slaughtered without mercy. The survivors are sent to die in Macedonian mines. To Alexander, the Greeks among them are traitors. Remember, the war is cast in pan-Hellenic colors, which means it's representing all people of Greek origin or ancestry. It's Greek versus the barbarians. So you, as Alexander, you can't really let the surviving mercenaries get away with it, can you? You gotta set a warning example, right? So after his victory at Granicus, Alexander goes ahead and, on the Acropolis at Athens, nails up 300 Persian suits of armor with the inscription, quote, Alexander, son of Philip, and the Greeks, except the Lacedaemonians, which means people of Sparta, dedicate these spoils from the barbarians who dwell in Asia, end quote. Again, Alexander's really good at sending public messages. He's putting those Persian armors on display in the most public, the most central spot in Athens, the Acropolis. The Acropolis of Athens was both a religious sanctuary and a political symbol. So Alexander's dedication of those 300 Persian suits of armor was probably a carefully staged act of propaganda, devotion, and unity. He's trying to link his personal triumph to the collective glory of Greece. And he's also trying to gain the favor of Athena, the city's patron deity herself. And of course, again, every word is deliberate. The Spartans are snubbed. The Greeks are reminded of who leads them now. Alexander proclaims freedom and democracy to the Greek cities of Asia Minor, and he's winning them to his cause. Alexander goes ahead and conquers Miletus, and it's almost polite. The walls come down, the defenders are spared, the city is really treated gently. Alexander is making a statement again, which is submit and I'll be magnanimous, resist and, well, that lesson comes next, because then comes Halicarnassus. Now, Halicarnassus, this place is a different beast. We got a coastal fortress city. It's bristling with towers, double walls, and a Persian garrison commanded by one of the most capable men alive, Memnon of Rhodes. This Memnon of Rhodes guy, If you're looking for a man who understands Alexander's Achilles heel, it is him. He's Greek by birth, but he's fighting for Persia, for pay, for power, maybe even for revenge. And unlike the Persian satraps who think wars are won with golden numbers, Memnon gets it. He knows this Macedonian whirlwind can't be stopped by a single battle. You have to starve Alexander. You have to delay him, bleed his supply lines dry. And for a moment, Memnon actually almost does. So Halicarnassus doesn't go quietly. Imagine night assaults, fire in the streets, siege engines clattering against the walls, Macedonian hypaspists clawing their way through narrow alleys, while defenders pour flaming pitch from above. Every step forward costs a lot of blood. But Alexander, again, doesn't quit, and he never does. The city burns, the defenders fight to the last, and when dawn finally breaks, Halicarnassus falls. Memnon escapes. He slips away with the Persian fleet, and that's a problem, because in a way, he's more dangerous now than before. He's a ghost on the sea, haunting Alexander's rear. He knows Greece. He knows that if he can stir up rebellion in the homeland, Alexander will be forced to turn back. He's not trying to win the war yet. He's trying to outlast Alexander's momentum. And again, Alexander wouldn't be Alexander if he didn't sense it. You can almost hear his thoughts. I have to move faster. There's no time to stop, no time to consolidate. He's got to push inland and deeper into the Persian heartland before Memnon can turn the Aegean into a battlefield behind him. That is the rhythm of this campaign. Speed as a weapon. Alexander's victory don't just come from steel and tactics, though. They come from momentum, from never letting the enemy breathe. Because somewhere out there on the sea, remember, Memnon of Rhodes is breathing, and that means danger. Through the winter, he drives down the southern coast, seizing ports like Lycia, Pamphylia, Pisidia. He's cutting the Persian navy off from their bases. He installs loyal satraps, which are the Persian Empire's province governors, by the way. He co-opts local dynasties. He even lets the exiled queen of Edda of Caria adopt him as her son. While all of this appears very calculated and planned ahead, I think we must not fall into the trap of thinking that they really had all the time in the world to do this abstract planning beforehand. You know, they're not sitting down at a table brainstorming for days and weeks. And I think Adrian Goldsworthy points us to the reality of things, which is, as Alexander, you're constantly out there fighting. You're traveling, you're conducting ceremonies, you're feasting, your agenda is very packed, and you don't have the time to plan all of these things ahead. So it's much more improvising on the go, one decision after another. We're moving on to spring 333 BCE. The air is thin and cool in the highlands of Phrygia. The Macedonian army, dust-caked and road-weary, marches into Gordium, a place already half forgotten by history, but alive with legend. Gordium isn't just another stop on the road east. This is one of those places where myth and man meet. The story goes that once upon a time, long before Alexander, a humble farmer named Gordias drove his ox cart into town. An oracle had told the Phrygians that the next man to ride into their city in a wagon would be their king. So they crowned this peasant, Gordias, and to honor Zeus, he ties up his wagon and its yoke with a knot so intricate, so impossibly tangled, that no one could ever untie it. Centuries later, that card, that nod, still sits there in the old royal citadel. The people of Phrygia whisper about it, and like every good legend, there's a prophecy attached. Whoever can untie the Gordian knot will rule all of Asia. Now, imagine being Alexander. You're 23 years old. You've beaten the Persians in battle. You've crossed the Hellespont like a new Achilles. You've been told by priests and by philosophers, by your own mother, that you are destined for greatness. And here in this dusty Anatolian backwater is a rope, a challenge, and a promise. Now, there are several accounts on this, one by Diodorus, one by Rufus, one by Plutarch, and one by Arrian, and also one by Justin. Me personally, I like Rufus's version of this story because I feel like it's the most exciting, the most cinematic one. Rufus, in his 10-book Alexander biography, tells us the story went something like this. Quote, "When he came to Gordium, he went to see the famous chariot which they say had belonged to Gordius, the father of Midas. Its yoke was bound with many closely entangled knots of cornel bark, nor could anyone see how they were fastened. An ancient prophecy had declared that whoever untied that knot would rule over Asia. Alexander, unwilling to delay, drew his sword and cut through the knots." End quote. Now imagine the scene. Alexander steps up to the wagon. There's soldiers, officers, local priests. They've all gathered around. The air is heavy with that peculiar kind of silence that comes before a myth is born. Alexander studies the knot. It's made of cornel bark, old and hard as iron, with no visible ends. It's a puzzle that's mocked kings and conquerors for generations. He frowns. He tugs at it once, twice, and then, in a flash of irritation or brilliance, he draws his sword. Shring! One clean stroke. The knot falls apart. And Alexander, with that characteristic mix of audacity and divine self-confidence, says something like, "It makes no difference how it's undone." Now, did this really happen? Probably not. At least not like that. The ancient sources can't agree. Some say he found a clever way to unlace it, slipping out a hidden pin instead of cutting it. Others think the story was invented later, when his legend needed more fuel. But here's the thing. It doesn't matter, because everyone believed it. The soldiers believed it, the people of Asia believed it, even the Persians, the ones who still thought they could resist him, must have heard the story and felt the chill, right? So from this point forward, Alexander stops being just a man on a campaign. Myth begins to wrap around him like armor. The line between strategy and destiny starts to blur. The Gordian knot isn't about cutting a rope. It's about cutting through fate itself. It's a declaration that Alexander won't be bound by prophecy or rules or even history. You know, he's the guy to rewrite all those things, right? And as he rides out of Gordium towards Issus and the next great collision with Persia, the whispers follow him. The gods are with him, the omens are clear, the boy from Macedon, the new Achilles, has just sliced his way into legend. Meanwhile, the old Memnon strikes back. He's seizing islands in the Aegean, threatening Alexander's lifeline to Europe, but then fate intervenes. Memnon dies. The one man that Persians needed the most is gone. Alexander surges east over the Taurus Mountains into Cilicia. The Persian heartland now looms beyond the horizon. Somewhere out there, Darius III gathers the full might of the empire. and Alexander, 23 years old, undefeated, unstoppable, marches straight toward him. Memnon is dead. It was at that moment that the entire course of the Persian war effort felt like it was tilted on its axis. Memnon of Rhodes wasn't just your average mercenary general. He was the man who saw Alexander for what he truly was. Not some brash Macedonian princeling playing conqueror, but a force of nature. And Memnon understood that trying to meet Alexander head on in the open field was suicide. You couldn't stop that guy. You had to starve him, break his will. So he urged the Persians to scorch the earth, to deny Alexander's supplies, to use time and distance as weapons instead of swords. But then he dies, just like that. Fever, illness. It's just nature claiming a man who might have saved an empire. And what happens next is the Persians lose their nerve. They lose their strategist, the cool, calculating plan of attrition vanishes with him, and it is replaced by pride and panic. So we see the great king's satraps, those men of noble birth, men who cannot conceive of running from an enemy, decide to do the one thing that Memnon warned them never to do. They decide to face Alexander in battle. Can you imagine what Alexander must have thought when he heard the news? One of his officers probably gallops up, dust on his cloak, breathless. "Sire, Memnon is dead." And Alexander, that shark of a man, must have felt the scent of blood in the water. The Persians had that one man who understood him, that one opponent who played chess while everyone else was out there swinging clubs. But he was gone. And so from that moment on, Persia's fate was sealed, basically. The war would no longer be fought in cautious steps and slow sieges. It would be fought in fire and chaos, which again happened to be just the kind of war that Alexander wanted. Indeed, Memnon's death means not only losing a general, but also Persia losing its best chance to stop the oncoming storm. After Memnon's death, suddenly the Persian court pivots. Imagine it like a great ship, vast, creaking, ancient. It's turning in the water very slowly. You can almost hear the sound of it, the groaning of timbers, the shouting of men, the slow grinding change of direction. So for years, Persia had been fighting these shadow wars, like indirect, cautious, and waged with gold instead of swords. The idea was to strangle Alexander's campaign in the cradle. They funded revolts in Greece, they tried to starve his supply lines and buy time. But then, something shifts in the royal palace at Susa. The great king Darius III, the king of kings, he decides to gamble everything. Darius abandons the war of whispers and bribes, and instead, what he does is he decides to fight in person. He's not sending his satraps, he's not sending any fleets, he's going himself now. And this is extraordinary when you think about it, because Persian monarchs didn't do that usually. They sent others to fight for them. They were the embodiment of empire, not its soldiers. So while Darius is preparing to face Alexander, out in the Aegean they had Pharnabazus and Autophradates, who were kind of trying to keep the lights on, but their campaign, the ghost of Memnon's vision, was fading fast. And they've had ships, they've had men, but what they didn't have was Memnon himself. So without him, It's all noise without harmony. Because these guys weren't very well versed in diplomacy either, their alliances slipped away too, like sand through their fingers. The only guys still loyal to the Persian court at this point are the Spartans. They still listen to Persian gold and Persian promises, but the rest, they are turning their backs. The grand coalition that once might have crushed Macedon suddenly dissolves. It is in that vacuum that the great king's pride begins to burn. Imagine Darius III in his palace, surrounded by courtiers and generals, the incense thick in the air, the gold gleaming on every surface. News arrives daily. This Alexander, he keeps marching deeper into Persian lands, wins another impossible battle, conquers another city that was supposed to be untouchable. And at some point, the great king must have slammed his fist down and said, enough is enough, right? Enough of retreat, enough of this foreign boy trampling the soil of Cyrus and Xerxes, enough humiliation. Darius turns his gaze westward, toward the horizon where the Macedonian sun is rising. Darius realizes that this thing isn't just political. This is religious, this is cosmic, because as the monarch of the Persian Empire, he isn't just a ruler. He is the earthly arm of Ahura Mazda, the god of light and order. And to allow this Macedonian interloper to continue unchecked isn't just a failure of statecraft, it's blasphemy. And so, as the priests chant and the banners unfurl, Darius decides that the time for whispers is over, that the empire will rise and meet its challenger head on. Darius is going to stare into the storm, and he's going to try to command it. So Darius summons the empire. They come, cavalry, infantry from Persia's heartland, levies from every corner of the realm, glittering columns of Greek mercenaries. The numbers swell to 2, maybe 3 times Alexander's army. Around this force swirls the moving city of the royal household, wives, concubines, slaves, baggage animals. The wealth of an empire is basically rolling on wagon wheels. The great king is going to war as only a great king can. Alexander by that time is already east of the Amanus Mountains, and he gets word. He reacts instantly, like a predator catching scent. He races north along the Gulf of Iskenderun, eager to close and kill, and then, like 2 sharks passing in deep water, they miss each other. Darius has marched further east. Suddenly the Persians are behind the Macedonians, and they finally meet at Issus. The Pinaros River cuts the plain. On the seaward side, the land narrows to 7 kilometers. It's boxed in between mountains and surf, which is basically a killing ground, right? Then you got Darius lining his men across the river like an enormous steel comb. 20,000 cavalry massed on the right wing, ready to scythe into the enemy flank. Greek hoplites and Persian infantry, 20 or 30,000 strong, holding the center and left, and in the very heart of the line, gleaming like a god, Darius himself stands on his royal chariot surrounded by the golden lance guard. On the right side we see Alexander taking his own post, astride with war horse, at the head of the companion cavalry. He shifts the Thessalians' left to blunt the Persian horse and sends light troops up into the hills. They're supposed to sweep away the enemy lurking there. So the entire stage for the battle is set, and then the charge happens. We see Alexander's wedge smashing forward. He's spearing toward the Persian left and hooks like a scythe into their center. You see chaos blooming. The Persian cavalry on the seaward flank begin to buckle the Macedonian line. They're pressing Parmenion back toward the shore. Victory seems within their grasp until, like lightning in the clear sky, Alexander bursts into the Persian center from the side. Suddenly he is there, before the great king himself. Now imagine being Darius, seeing the flashing bronze, the roaring Macedonian wedge, the crumbling of his own man, and I guess that's when fear must have struck him, because he decides to signal retreat. The King of Kings flees. What follows is a panic detonating through the entire Persian army. What had been a line becomes a mob. The seaward cavalry scatter, the Greeks fight on, grim and stubborn, but now they too collapse. The Macedonians sweep the field. The slaughter is immense, and the victory is total. Within a few days, Alexander storms Damascus. He seizes the Persian baggage train, the royal treasury, and the entire royal family, mother, wife, children, all of them alive. He treats them with scrupulous respect, as if already they're sovereign. Now imagine the psychological effect that must have had, right? They were used to the myth of Persian invincibility that lingered on for centuries, and it suddenly shatters in front of their eyes, right? Marathon and Salamis had checked the empire, but here on Persian soil, Alexander breaks it. Of course, the world notices, and the Phoenician cities quickly line up to submit. Sidon opens its gates, Aradus swears loyalty. The Aegean War dies overnight, basically. But one city stands defiant. The city we're talking about is Tyre. It's a proud ancient city, the mother of Carthage, and it's a fortress of the sea. Alexander demands entry to the city. He wants to sacrifice to Melkart, the city's god, whom the Greeks equate with Heracles, Alexander's own claimed ancestor. However, the Tyrians refuse entry. Alexander's response is pure fury. For 8 months, he grinds them down. He builds a colossal causeway from the mainland, stone by stone, into the surf. At the same time, his newly allied fleets close in from the sea, and in August 332, Tyre falls. Alexander decides to set an example. 8,000 dead, 30,000 sold into slavery, 2,000 crucified along the beaches, their bodies bleaching in the sun. And then, having annihilated the unconquered city, Alexander finally performs his sacrifice to Heracles. In the aftermath of the battle, while the smoke is still rising from the ruins of Issus, somewhere in the chaos, couriers ride out and they carry letters, not swords, because Darius, the great king, remember, he has lost more than a battle. He's lost his family. His mother, his wife, his daughters, they're all in Macedonian hands, so he does what kings rarely do. He begs. The first letter is almost plaintive, a plea for mercy. He offers Alexander friendship, alliance, even rich territories in Western Asia. It's a gesture of reconciliation, an appeal to reason. And Alexander laughs at him, because this is far from just a negotiation. This is psychological warfare for Alexander. Darius is playing diplomacy. Alexander is playing dominance. Alexander sends word back that if Darius wants his family, he's welcome to come and take them by defeating him in battle. It's a taunt delivered across an empire, but Darius isn't finished. The next offer is bigger, impossibly big. half the Persian Empire, everything west of the Euphrates, Egypt, a royal marriage. Now, that's not just gold and land, that's legitimacy, right? That's a path to empire without more bloodshed. Alexander calls his council, the old veterans, men who have been with him since the days of Philip, and they gather to debate. Parmenion, the grizzled realist, speaks first. Parmenion looks at the offer and says almost wearily, "I'd accept if I were Alexander." And as legend has it, Alexander is supposed to have replied, "So would I if I were Parmenion." So clearly, again, we see Alexander's ambition. It's stripped of all pretense, right? He doesn't want half an empire. He does want the entire empire. He wants everything, the whole of Persia, the throne of Darius. The idea, maybe even the reality of ruling the entire known world. And yet, he waits. This is the part people often forget. After Issus, after Tyre, Alexander doesn't go charging straight into the heart of Persia. He turns south. And there's a good reason why Alexander decides to turn south first, and it makes a lot of sense strategically, because Sparta is stirring a revolt back home, the Greek cities are restless, and Egypt, most importantly, ancient and wealthy, lies open and vulnerable. The idea is to secure the coast, secure the grain routes, the ports, the supply lines, because you can't just march into Asia with enemies at your back, right? So you take the logical path southward through blood and sand. At first, Gaza resists him, the last city on the coastal road, but Alexander makes an example of it once again. The siege drags on. It's very brutal and costly, and when Gaza falls, he shows no mercy. The defenders are slaughtered, survivors sold into slavery. And then finally, when he enters Egypt, Alexander enters not as a conqueror, but as something else entirely. Egypt. For the Persians, Egypt has always been a problem child. They conquer it, they lose it, they reconquer it, and for some reason it still slips through their fingers. Imagine the Nile Delta with its mazes of channels. There's rebellious local dynasts you gotta deal with, and there's deeply entrenched priesthoods. It all just remains stubbornly un-Persian at heart. So that's why they struggle a lot. Only 10 years before Alexander arrives, actually, the empire has crushed yet another wave of independence developing in Egypt. You got Artaxerxes III, who had ruled with an iron fist. He was insulting Egyptian religion. He used to desecrate its gods, and the people, they never forgot. Now comes Alexander, and as he arrives in Egypt, he takes the exact opposite approach. The Persian satrap doesn't even resist him. He hands the province over, just like that. Alexander enters as if in triumph, but he's not being arrogant. He plays the part of pharaoh. He bows to the traditions. In Memphis, he decides to sacrifice to Apis, the sacred bull. Then in Karnak and Luxor, he orders the restoration of sanctuaries. Alexander becomes pharaoh in every sense when you think about it. He's the guardian of the land. He's the protector of the Nile cycles. Alexander also becomes guarantor of the so-called Maat, the Egyptian divine order. And with that, the Egyptian priesthood, the real power, embraces him. They crown him as pharaoh. They call him son of Amun-Re, the many-formed sun god. But see, what is the main difference between Alexander and, say, your average pharaoh, who kind of sits around his palace and has everything prearranged for him. Alexander is a Macedonian king and a Greek warlord. When you understand administration, you know how to split power carefully. You leave the temples alone to remain in Egyptian hands, but defense, trade, and finance? Those go to Macedonians and Greeks. And the most important man of all of this is Cleomenes of Naucratis. Now this guy, Cleomenes, is a Greek from Egypt's only Greek-founded city, Naucratis, along the trade outpost between Egypt and the wider Mediterranean. Cleomenes becomes sort of the financial overlord, if you will. Within years, he's practically running Egypt on Alexander's behalf. Alexander's stay in Egypt overall is just defined by two great gestures, basically. One of which is coldly rational and the other is strangely mystical. Together they show the two halves of this man. Let's begin with the rational, the founding of Alexandria itself. Early in 331 BC, he orders a city raised from nothing in the western Nile Delta opposite the island of Pharos, immortalized in Homer's verses. Alexander chooses the site with ruthless logic between the sea and an island lake linked to both the Nile and the Mediterranean. This is like a natural hub for trade. Tyre is rubble, Gaza lies ruined, the Levant's commercial lifelines are gone, and Alexander wants a new center, a Greek center. He wants to funnel wealth and taxes straight into his coffers. And so he builds Alexandria, a polis in the truest Greek sense with its own citizen body, its own affairs, its mix of populations, Greeks, Macedonians, Egyptians, Syrians, Jews. But let's not forget, it's also a monument to himself, right? A city to bear his name forever, to project his glory across seas and centuries. The engineers draw its grid, the architects plan its harbor, and the dream takes shape. This is not just a city we're talking about, but the city, a jewel of trade, power, and Hellenic civilization. But then comes the mystical part of Alexander's stay in Egypt, his march to Siva. Far out in the desert lies the great oasis, with its ancient oracle of Amun. For centuries, pharaohs have consulted it. Greek colonists know it too. They call the god Zeus Ammon, ram-horned father of heroes. To Greeks, Siva stands along Delphi and Dodona as one of the world's greatest sacred voices. Heracles and Perseus themselves are said to have spoken there. So why does Alexander go? I mean, from a purely strategical standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of sense, does it? Remember, Darius is regrouping in Mesopotamia, and time is short, and yet Alexander plunges into the desert. Why? Why would he do that? Because this is not strategy, this is theater, this is myth. Alexander has become the pharaoh now, but pharaoh is also son of Amun-Re. If Siva proclaims it, if the oracle itself declares it, then Alexander is not merely king, he becomes divine. So the priests welcome him, the rituals unfold. What is asked, what is answered? Alexander keeps it secret, we don't know. But the message, however phrased, seems clear enough. He is son of Zeus Ammon, a demigod, a new Heracles. And maybe he's destined to rule the world. We got the Greeks lapping it up. Historians embroider the tale with miracles, desert storms, divine guidance. And soon, stories circulate of Alexander's conception. Was it Philip of Macedon or Zeus himself in disguise who fathered him? Again, we see the line between myth and man beginning to blur here. For Alexander, perhaps, it's deeply personal. Later, when Hephaestion dies, he will ask the Sever oracle about his friend's honors. He will even wish to be buried there himself. I mean, this is no casual stunt, is it? I think it is part of his own inner story, his longing, his pathos, which we already discussed in the beginning of this episode, remember? That insatiable drive that pushes him beyond reason. So, here in Egypt, we see the paradox of Alexander laid bare. You've got the ruthless planner who founds Alexandria to dominate trade, the visionary who restores temples to win over priests, the man who marches into a desert for no tactical gain, only to emerge with the aura of a god. To Alexander, though, these are not contradictions, remember. They are pieces of the same mosaic. In his world, the practical and the mythical are not opposites. They are allies. And in blending them, Alexander becomes something larger than life. A conqueror, yes, but also already a legend. It's April 331 BCE, when Alexander leaves Egypt behind. The temples, the oracles, the new city bearing his name, all of that stuff fades into the desert dust behind him. Ahead of him lies the heart of the Persian Empire, where the true showdown will await him. He heads north through Tyre's ruins and also the fertile Bekaa Valley. They keep going until the Euphrates glimmers before them, and they get to choose between two routes which lie open, one of which is south along the river's lazy curve toward Babylon and Susa, the easy road, or they go east across the brutal, waterless steppes of northern Mesopotamia to reach the Tigris and Persian royal road beyond. The easy road, though, may already be gone. The Persian satrap Mazaeus uses what in military context is generally referred to as scorched earth policy, meaning the Persian army are burning down the harvests and razing the depots while retreating. So the land itself turns hostile, but Alexander doesn't flinch. He doesn't do easy stuff, as we already know by now. So he knows Darius is waiting across the Tigris, and that's exactly where he wants to go. Because this is it, right? This is supposed to be the reckoning. Alexander's eager to bring by a decision. He wants to finish this business once and for all. Darius too is ready. Since Isosi's had almost 2 years to raise a new army, vaster and deadlier than before. He's learned his lessons. This time he will fight as the King of Kings should, at the head of the largest army on earth. From the eastern reaches of the empire come the cavalry of Bactria and Sogdiana, ferocious horsemen from the edge of the known world. Median and Anatolian riders fill the flanks, and war elephants rumble in from India. We got Scythe chariots and around 40,000 cavalry in total, so 200,000 infantry as well, almost forgot. A force so immense, actually, that the earth seems to groan beneath it. Can you imagine that? And Darius has chosen his battlefield carefully this time. The plain of Gaugamela, near Arbela. It's a vast open expanse, flat, featureless, but deadly. It seems perfect for chariots and cavalry to run wild. His engineers have even leveled the ground, removing rocks and bumps so nothing can hinder his skiffed wheels, and he will fight this battle on his terms. On his left, Darius places his finest Bactrians, Sogdians, and Scythians. Under his kinsman Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, who is second in rank only to the great king himself. In the center stands Darius. His royal chariot is surrounded by the immortals, the Greek mercenaries, the elephants, the chariots, and behind him waits the reserve, drawn from Babylon's levies. On the right, the satrap Mazaeus commands the cavalry from Media and Anatolia. Alexander crosses the steppes and he finds them waiting for him. His scouts report the scale of what's ahead, and still he doesn't hesitate. His army is much smaller, leaner, but they're also harder than the Persians. About 7,000 cavalry and 10,000 Macedonian infantry, 3,000 Hypaspists, 2,000 archers and slingers, and another 20,000 mercenaries and allies from the rugged lands of Thrace and Illyria. He knows he can't match the Persian line for width, so he'll use depth instead, discipline, and also speed. He arranges his troops at Issus. On the right, you got the companion cavalry, which is his personal hammer. Of course, they're led by himself. In the center, we see the Phalanx and the Hypaspists. On the left, Parmenion with the Thessalians. But this time, Alexander also plans for encirclement. He layers his line. He posts light troops on the flanks. He sets a second line of hoplites behind the center, all ready to turn and fight in any direction necessary. So we see that every angle is basically covered here. Then October 1st, 331 BCE, right at dawn, the two greatest armies of the ancient world face each other in the cool Mesopotamian light. Alexander begins to move first, slowly, deliberately. To his right, the maneuver is classic. It's almost a taunt at this point. Darius reacts. He's sending his left wing under Bessus to shadow him. The lines stretch, they bend, they strain, and then we see an explosion when Mazaeus hurls his cavalry against Parmenion's left. The Macedonian line buckles. At the same moment, Bessus charges Alexander's flank, and Darius releases the chariots. Blades flash, wheels scream, horses foam. But the Macedonian light troops are ready. They open gaps, they let the chariots pass, then cut down the crews from behind. Alexander sees this opportunity and he decides that the Persian left has swung way too far out while chasing him, so he sees the gap opens in the center and he decides to wheel hard left, form a wedge with the companions, and drive straight into the heart of the Persian line. The Persians are shocked, and the companion cavalry tears through the gap like a spear, straight towards Darius himself. The royal chariot lurches, chaos ripples through the center, and once again, the King of Kings falters. Once again, he turns and flees. While Darius flees, his army starts to break. But on the left, however, Parmenion's wing is still in desperate straits. They're nearly being overwhelmed by the Persians. Word reaches Alexander mid-pursuit. He has to choose. Do I finish the king or save my men? He decides to turn back. The companions wheel around, hit Mazaeus' cavalry from behind and rout them. The field dissolves into slaughter, the great king escapes east again, but this time everyone knows the truth. There will be no recovery from that, no second resurrection of Persian power. So on that dusty plain, amid the bodies and the shattered chariots, Alexander is hailed as King of Asia. Now, King of Asia, that is more than a title. It is the fulfillment of his destiny. Ever since he hurled that spear across the Hellespont and claimed Asia as his by right of conquest, now symbolically, mythically, and politically, it is done. He declares that the Persian War is finished, and what began with marathon and salamis, what his ancestors fought for, he has finally completed. The Greeks, through him, now rule in the heart of the empire they once feared. He sends spoils back to the homeland, to Croton in Italy, to Plataea in Greece, as tokens of vengeance and victory, as if to say, the ghosts of Thermopylae can rest now. Babylon. Even the name feels heavy, and by the time Alexander approaches its towering walls in the autumn of 331 BCE, Babylon has already stood for thousands of years. It's a city that was once the axis of the world. You gotta imagine its ziggurats rising like mountains of baked clay, its temples glinting with glazed brick and gold, streets cut through the city like measured veins of civilization. For 3 millennia, Babylon has embodied a single idea, that the ruler on earth is the reflection of the divine in heaven. Now, to be honest, that sounds a little similar to the Pope of the Christian Church to me. The Pope as the vicar of God on earth. When the Persians conquered the city 2 centuries earlier, they started to adopt that tradition. The great kings called themselves servants of Marduk. Marduk is Babylon's god, and at first they honored the city's rituals, but as time goes by, we see that by Xerxes' day, the temples had fallen into neglect, and the Babylonians, still proud and deeply religious, began, however, to seethe under Persian rule. So when Alexander arrives, the young foreign conqueror from the west, they do something remarkable. They just open their gates for him. Can you imagine that? Even more astonishing, Mazaeus, the Persian satrap, who only months ago fought against Alexander at Gaugamela, now rides out to surrender the city. There's no siege, no resistance. It's only a procession going on. One of the primary sources that describes Alexander's entry into Babylon is Arrian's Anabasis of Alexander. In Book 3, Chapter 16, he describes the moment like this. Again, this is purely based on early eyewitness accounts by Ptolemy and Aristobulus. Quote, "When he," meaning Alexander, "approached the walls, the Babylonians came out, opening the gates and strewing the ground with flowers. They brought gifts of silver and gold, and led him and his companions into the city with songs and garlands. Entering Babylon, Alexander ordered the destruction of no building, and he admired the city's fortifications and the size of the palace." End quote. Just for a quick comparison, let's look at Curtius Rufus, who also records the event. He's emphasizing the voluntary surrender of the Babylonians, and he tells the story something like this, quote, "The Babylonians, eager to see their new master, poured forth in crowds, welcoming Alexander with prayers and gifts. The gates were thrown open, not a man resisted him. He entered the city as though returning to his own kingdom. not as a conqueror. End quote. So we see Alexander enters Babylon almost like a god returning home. I mean, what an amazing atmosphere that must have been, right? The crowds line the streets, they're throwing flowers at him, shouting praise. The Macedonian king, he's probably still got some dust of war on him, and he steps into the role the city has been waiting to bestow, the restorer, the righteous ruler. And of course, we know by now that Alexander is a man of action, so he wastes no time. He orders the ruined temples rebuilt, he sacrifices to Marduk, and he revives the ancient ceremonies of kingship. Of course, again, every act is deliberate, every gesture is symbolic, and he is both conqueror and heir to the throne of Persia, and he knows it. Like Cyrus before him, Alexander understands the secret of empire. You don't destroy traditions, you inherit them. Might as well use the traditions to your advantage, right? Like, wear them like an armor, basically. He also keeps Mazaeus in his post as satrap, and he's placing Macedonian officers only over the garrisons. It is indeed a pragmatic balance, but he's also making a statement here that the old and the new will rule together under him. And in Babylon, it is when something changes inside of Alexander. The city of gods and kings begins to seep into his mind. His entire idea of what rulership means begins to change. He realizes that here in Persia, kings don't just rule the world, they embody the world. It is almost as if the title King of Asia stops being a boast and it kind of turns into a job description, if you will. Somewhere in his mind, the idea of world dominion, not just victory, but universal kingship, seems to harden into a vision in Babylon. So from Babylon, he keeps moving east to Susa, the ancient capital of Elam, one of the three beating hearts of the Persian Empire at the time. It's December 331 BCE when he enters its gates. Susa surrenders without a fight. Inside the city, he finds the unimaginable, the great king's treasury, mountains of gold and silver accumulated through centuries of tribute, wealth on a scale that defies anyone's comprehension. Alexander grabs it all. But rather than hoarding the stuff, he goes ahead and melts it. The precious metals that had once been sacred symbols of royal power, he simply transforms them into coins, his coins. Probably not the best idea, right? I mean, I bet you can already see what happens next when we flood the ancient economy, or any economy for that matter, with money, can't you? Alexander unleashes inflation across the eastern Mediterranean. Entire markets shift, trade expands, the Hellenistic world begins to take shape, an economic revolution born from conquest. And in Susa, the king does something that shocks even his own man. He sits upon the throne of the Achaemenids. This is a very meaningful gesture. We see the conqueror taking the seat of the conquered. Is Alexander a usurper or successor? Is he avenger or heir? The line blurs. The boy who once cast his spear into Asia, claiming it as spoil, now sits enthroned in Asia's heart, and he's claiming it as an inheritance. Of course, Alexander wouldn't be Alexander if he stopped there, right? So the road leads further, this time to Persis, the homeland of the Persians themselves. Somewhere in the shadow of the Zagros Mountains lies Persepolis, the ceremonial capital. The palace of Darius the Great is there, and it's a city built not for war but for awe instead. You gotta imagine massive stairways carved with the faces of subject peoples bearing tribute, reliefs of kings and immortals, and eternal empire in stone. And merely 6 kilometers away, carved into a cliff at Nakshi Rustam, the tombs of the ancient kings, those are like silent witnesses to centuries of power. It is here at last when Alexander meets resistance. Between Susa and Persis, the mountain tribes bar the passes. The narrow defile known as the Persian Gate becomes a death trap for the Macedonians. For a moment, the ghosts of Thermopylae seem to echo in reverse. Greeks are forcing the pass against Persians this time. Through cunning and a flanking maneuver, Alexander takes them from behind and crushes their defense. By January 330 BC/BCE, Persepolis itself capitulates. Unlike in Babylon and Susa, however, this time Alexander enters the city in a different fashion. The gates open and his soldiers pour in, and for the first time since Gaugamela, the mask of reverence drops. Persepolis is given over to plunder. The Macedonians go ahead and rip the treasures from the halls of Darius's palace. Still, however, Alexander performs his usual gestures of legitimacy. He's once again confirming satraps. He visits the tomb of Cyrus the Great at Pasargadae, and Alexander even kneels before the founder of the empire he has just destroyed. It's almost as if he meant to say, "I am your successor now." Now, a couple of months later, during one of those long Macedonian nights of feasting and wine, something interesting happens. The palace of Persepolis goes up in flames. Ancient sources argue endlessly about why this happens, and most of them agree that it's probably revenge for Xerxes' invasion of Greece and the burning of Greek temples, especially Athens, a century and a half earlier. Where the sources differ in their interpretation is, however, whether they think it is a planned or an impulsive act by Alexander and his men. Arrian and Diodorus say that the burning and plundering was calculated decision. Plutarch and Rufus see it more as an act done in wine and passion. The drunken story goes something like this, quote, Alexander, deep in his cups, surrounded by friends and courtesans, is egged on by one woman in particular, Thais, an Athenian Hetaira, the lover of his general Ptolemy. She tells him that nothing would complete his vengeance like burning the house of Xerxes himself. Alexander, flushed with wine and pride, seizes a torch. The others follow, and soon the palace is ablaze, fire devouring the cedar beams, smoke rising into the night like a funeral pyre for an empire. End quote. Whether the burning was a deliberate and planned ahead thing or it was an impulsive act out of drunkenness doesn't even matter. What's most important here is that we see the Alexander of myth beginning to eclipse the Alexander of flesh and blood. The conqueror who came to topple an empire now wears its crown. The avenger of Greece now kneels at Persian tombs. And the man who built cities for eternity burns palaces for night's thrill. The war is not over, not yet. It's the spring of 330 BCE. The great king Darius III is still alive. He's fleeing, he's bleeding, and he has been humiliated, but he's still alive, and Alexander cannot let him live. You, as Alexander, are suffering from pothos, which doesn't let you rest while there is still an idea of Persia breathing in your mind. You just cannot accept that there might be a single ember of that old world still glowing. So, as Alexander, you go ahead and push northeast out of the Persian heartland through the Zagros Mountains toward the high plateau of Media, and ahead you find Ecbatana, the ancient Median capital. It is older than Persepolis, older even than Babylon, and it's always been one of the royal cities, a summer seat of empire nestled between mountain and desert, and that is exactly where Darius runs. And when Alexander arrives, there is no resistance left. The city yields almost immediately. Darius has already fled further east, running from both his conqueror and his own nobles at this point. The great king's aura, once blinding, is now flickering out. As Alexander enters Ecbatana, one of the last royal capitals, he does something remarkable that signals the end of one era and the beginning of another. He dismisses the Greek allied troops. This is when the Greek war against Persia, that crusade that Philip, his father, had once dreamed of, that began as a revenge for Xerxes' invasion, is finally over. It is finished. And from now on, there is no longer a war of Greeks against Persians. It is Alexander's war from now on. He is alone. But not only is this moment symbolic, it is also a strategic decision, because Alexander is building something permanent here. Ecbatana becomes the new hinge of his empire, the pivot point between west and east. From here, supply lines are supposed to stretch back to Macedonia and Greece, forward to the uncharted lands beyond the Hindu Kush. And to hold this important artery, Alexander leaves behind his most trusted general, Parmenion. The old man, father of Philotas, the voice of restraint in a world that now obeys only momentum. And with that, Alexander moves on. He drives his men in forced marches across the highlands through dust and wind. He's chasing Darius, who's retreating through the Caspian Gates, which is a narrow corridor between mountain and desert, and one of the last defensible choke points in all of Persia. But the great king is running out of time, as his nobles, men like Bessus, the satrap of Bactria, his men, they just have had enough. The defeats at Issus and Gaugamela broke the myth of Darius's divine favor, and in the Persian world, that meant everything. So if the Persian king is no longer blessed by Ahura Mazda, that means he is no longer king. And so we see his own men turning on him. Bessus and his allies seize Darius. They strip him of his dignity and proclaim Bessus the new ruler. Now, when Alexander hears about this, the idea of them getting to Darius before him, it drives Alexander crazy. He becomes obsessed with capturing Darius. But when he finally arrives there through the wastelands east of the Caspian Gates, Darius has already been struck down by his captors, stabbed and left bleeding in a wagon. When Alexander finally catches up, he finds Darius's corpse. It's still warm. Darius died before Alexander saw him, Arrian writes. And there in that desolate place, the conqueror of the world stands over the body of his greatest enemy. Well, this should be a moment of triumph, but it isn't for Alexander because something profound happens here. It is something symbolic once again and also mythic. Alexander weeps. He takes the dying king's hand, covers him with his own cloak, and orders that he be buried with full honors in the royal tombs at Nakshirustam among the Achaemenid kings. Isn't it weird how victory can feel hollow at times? You know, that psychological vacuum you feel when your defining enemy is gone. It reminds me of the Tyson Fury story. The kid from Manchester who grew up with the promise of beating Vladimir Klitschko someday. And then he eventually did beat Klitschko. I remember Fury describing on the Joe Rogan podcast how he felt a massive high initially after the win, but then how he quickly fell into what he described as a gaping hole of depression that he struggled to get out of for quite some time. Thank God he was able to recover. So maybe Alexander could have felt similar to that. The truth is, we'll never really know, I'm afraid. However, there is another much more sober and calculated explanation for what at first sight appears to be Alexander's change of mind. And we've talked about this in the show on Damnatio Memoriae. For those of you who remember or might want to check that out, it's the first episode of the channel. The ancient idea of legitimacy through burial, burying your enemy to take their crown, burial rites as a form of public communication, drawing a line under your predecessor's reign and beginning your own one. I like to believe it might have been a mixture of both of these aspects, emotional and political calculation. In any case, by claiming the Persian throne, Alexander completes a transformation that's been building for years. He is no longer just a destroyer of the Persian Empire, he is its heir. A line that began when he threw his spear into Asia has come full circle. The conqueror becomes the successor. And it is from this moment forward that Alexander is not just king of Macedon or lord of Asia. He is the new great king. And as the great king, he goes ahead and avenges Darius's murder with ruthless efficiency. Bessus is hunted, captured, mutilated, executed, and then Alexander begins to rule. But rule in this new world means change. He keeps Persian satraps in office where he can. He draws Persian nobles into his inner circle, men like Oxyatres, Darius's brother, and Artabazus, the loyal old satrap. He integrates Iranian troops into his army, thousands of them. Eventually, he trains 30,000 young Persians in Macedonian tactics, blending the two military cultures into one. And his appearance begins to change too. He starts to wear the royal diadem, also the soft Persian robe, the jeweled belt. He uses Darius's own seal ring to stamp his decrees. His court ceremonies become a fusion of East and West, Greek pragmatism dressed in Persian splendor. To the Persians, this makes perfect sense. The king is divine and ceremony affirms that truth. But to the Macedonians, this new Alexander begins to look alien. I mean, when you think about it, isn't it ironical how the Greeks used to call the Persian kings despots, and now their champion becomes one of them? Again, was it pragmatic genius or the moment when Alexander began losing himself in the costume of divinity? I'll leave that up for you to decide. Eventually, then, comes the breaking point, proskinesis. In Persian tradition, when you approach the great king, you bow. The degree of bow depends on your rank. For the Greeks, on the other hand, this is unthinkable. You kneel to gods, not men. To perform proskinesis before Alexander feels to them like worshipping a mortal, like becoming a slave. When Alexander tries to introduce the ritual, the reaction is silent horror. His historian Callisthenes, nephew of Aristotle himself, refuses to perform it. He thinks it's tyranny, he thinks it's despotism, and Alexander actually backs down for now. But the tension simmers. The lines between Macedonian comradeship and Persian divinity have clearly begun to blur at this point, and no one knows how to stand in this new world. And then comes the so-called Philotas affair. Philotas, son of Parmenion, commander of the elite Campanian cavalry, a man of immense prestige. He's Alexander's second in command. In Drangiana, today's southwestern Afghanistan, a whisper spreads through camp. It's a conspiracy against the king. The story is murky, the evidence is really thin. Maybe Philotas heard of a plot and failed to report it. Maybe he boasted one time to many that he, not Alexander, was the real genius behind the victories. Or maybe he simply represented something Alexander could no longer tolerate. The old Macedonian guard, the man of Philip's generation, his father's, who still thought of the king as first among equals instead of divine master of the world. Whatever the truth might be, Alexander seizes his chance. Philotas is arrested, he's tried before the army and then condemned. Some say he's tortured before being executed, and within days messengers write to Ecbatana. Parmenion, the old general, is murdered in his quarters before he even knows his son is dead. This is, of course, brutal and calculated, but again, it works for Alexander. And the message here is clearly unmistakable. The old order is gone. The last man who could remember a world where Alexander was not supreme are dead. And in their place rise new favorites. Hephaestion, his closest friend, and Clytus, the man who once saved his life. Loyalty, not lineage, is now the coin of power. The Philotas affair changes everything, though. It's not just the end of a family, this is the end of restraint, the final death of Macedonian collegiality. And Alexander has crossed the line. The boy who once burned with revenge for Greece now rules from Babylon to Bactria as a god king. In silk, he's surrounded by Persians and priests. The army still follows him? How could they not, right? But somewhere in the silence after the executions, you can hear the first cracks forming in the bond between the conqueror and his men. Now, what would you do? You followed him for years. He's never lost. He's half a god now. Do you question him or just keep marching east? Your king, the man who began as a liberator of Greeks, has now become the master of Asia. That student of Aristotle now lives like an Eastern god, and every step forward will take him deeper into that transformation towards something the ancient world has never seen before. The corpse of Darius still lies fresh in memory when Alexander turns his gaze east. The great king is dead, but his ghost really isn't. His murderer Bessus has fled beyond the mountains, calling himself by a new royal name, which is Artaxerxes, King of Kings. It's a hollow title now, but it's still a title that Alexander cannot ignore. Isn't it interesting? The psychology of succession, how even defeated regimes try to keep legitimacy alive by using sacred titles. And what is power really? Is it armies or is it the idea of kingship that people can't let die? When Bessus flees and claims that ancient title Artaxerxes, King of Kings, for himself, he's hoping to preserve legitimacy that way, I guess. It kind of reminds us of some of the modern age dictators who did the same, doesn't it? You have like Mussolini, who claimed to revive the glory of ancient Rome while keeping the structure of the Italian monarchy nominally intact for years. And you have Stalin, who preserved Lenin's image and mausoleum to cloak his dictatorship in revolutionary legitimacy. And then we have Franco in Spain, who maintained the illusion of continuity with Spain's traditional monarchy and Catholic heritage. Going back to Alexander, he first secures the land south of the Caspian Sea, stamping out little ambers of rebellion, reorganizing the satrapies. He's installing new governors. It's really a purge wrapped in policy if we look at it. In Araya, Drangiana, Arachosia, he replaces old faces with men he can trust. Sometimes those are Macedonians, often they are Persians. Artabazos, the loyal satrap, becomes his key man in the region. Even here on the edges of civilization, Alexander is building a new political order. It's half Macedonian and half Iranian. And really, everywhere he goes, he leaves behind a calling card, which are cities. Herat, Kandahar, Kabul. Their ancient names are different, but they all share one word: Alexandria. Is this about civilization anymore, though? Or is it about stamping your name across the map, almost like a graffiti on the world? Alexander the Builder follows Alexander the Conqueror. Each city becomes a beacon of Greek order in the chaos of empire. And those cities are not just fortresses, those are statements. He's planting civilization itself, or at least his version of it. The polis, the Greek city state, reborn in the mountains of Afghanistan. Ironically, of course, those so called civilizing outposts are built on bones, ruins, and blood. We're moving on to spring 329 BCE, and the snows begin to thaw. Alexander leads his army over the Hindu Kush, the spine of Asia. The passes are brutal. Think about thin air, the blinding snow they must have encountered, starvation. His men freeze to death on the trail. Horses collapse and are left to die, but they still move on, always east. God, the sheer human suffering of conquest, right? History likes to tell you where there went. It rarely tells you what it felt like, does it? I guess that's just the cost of ambition sometimes. Thousands dying to fulfill one man's vision. Beyond the mountains lies Bactria. Bactria is rich in fields and horsemen. The capital, Bactra, modern-day Balkh, surrenders without a fight. Alexander has marched 5,000 kilometers since leaving Persepolis, remember? The empire of Darius lies behind him, it's shattered, and before him stretches an entire new world, alien, it's vast, almost mythical. To the north lies Sogdiana, which is a frontier of deserts and rivers. The Persians once held this as a shield against the nomads. Nomads, of course, meaning the Scythians and the Massagetae, wild horsemen who are continuously sweeping down from the steppe. The settled people here live in walled cities. Those cities are usually ruled by a proud warrior aristocracy, men who once served the great kings as elite cavalry. Now some rally to Bessus, but Bessus fails them. He cannot stop the advancing Macedonian machine that is Alexander. And when Alexander crosses the Oxus, the nobles turn on their would-be king. They capture him, they strip him naked, and they actually deliver him to Alexander. That scene is pure theater. Bessus is dragged before the army in chains and iron collar. He's humiliated before the man he betrayed. Alexander hands him over the Persian tribunal for judgment, and mutilation happens. Nose and ears are cut off, paraded as a warning. Justice is served the Persian way, if you will, but of course under a Macedonian's authority. So Alexander avenges Darius, and he adopts Persian customs in the same act. He's not just punishing a rebel here. He's showing the Persian elite that he understands their world and means to rule it as one of them. Again, the irony of Alexander using Persian customs to prove his legitimacy, adopting the very methods he once condemned. And I don't mean to say this judgingly or anything, I'm just pointing it out here. But Then again, when the conqueror starts acting like the conquered, what's left of the difference? By summer, Marakanda or Samarkand falls, the frontier rivers, the Oxus and the Iaxartes, mark the edge of the known world, and beyond it lies the endless steppe, that realm of the nomads. To Greek minds, this is the edge of the earth, where the world ends and the oceans begin. Alexander celebrates the moment as only he can. He builds yet another city. On the banks of the Iaxartes, he founds Alexandria Skate, which translates to the farthest Alexandria. It is both a fortress and a monument to the idea that there is no edge of the world anymore to Alexander. He's reached the border of myth, and he intends to push it further. Again, we witness the psychological dimension of limitlessness. What drives a man who can't stop? In Alexander's case, it must have been that pathos once again, that inner burning fire and longing we've discussed so many times now. I don't want to sound like a broken record by repeating this over and over again, but it is a recurring theme with Alexander at different stages in his life. Imagine being a soldier standing there at what the Greeks thought was the end of the world, realizing your king doesn't believe in endings. Also, conquest here is not simple. The easy victories of Persia are long gone. The terrain is a nightmare. You got deserts, fortresses, hidden valleys, and the enemy melds into the mountains and then strikes you from out of nowhere seemingly. The Sogdian nobles rise in rebellion. Their leader, Spitamenes, is a genius of guerrilla warfare. He really uses mobility to his advantage. He's never giving battle, always retreating, always striking again. He draws support from the nomads of the steppes, and he vanishes into the desert when pressed. So Alexander, for once, cannot find his enemy, actually. For 2 years, the war drags on. It's a war of attrition, ambush, and revenge. Something between insurgency and vendetta, if you will. The Macedonians learn to fight small, splitting into little mobile units under trusted generals. And they burn fortresses, they build garrisons, they crush rebellion, one valley at a time. And I think you could drop these guerrilla tactics into Afghanistan 20 centuries later, and they'd still work, right? Anyways, when Alexander finally captures a fortress said to be impregnable, he makes sure everyone knows it's part warfare, part propaganda. And as always, his sharpest weapon is not the sword, it's his politics, right? He punishes some rebels with horrifying severity. Others he pardons, rewards, or welcomes into his inner circle even. It's really the philosophy of carrot and stick, I guess. Conquest and co-option. And by 327 BCE, Spitamenes is dead, killed by his own allies. His head is sent to Alexander as a tribute. And then, in a gesture that's both personal and political, Alexander marries Roxana, the daughter of the Sogdian noble Oxyartes. Roxana is a beautiful, noble and she's a local, which is, again, a symbol of reconciliation and union that this marriage between Alexander and her represents. Oxyartes himself joins Alexander's circle, and his sons are also enrolled among the companions. The conqueror of Persia now binds Central Asia not by force but by blood. The Macedonian and the Iranian aristocracies, they begin to fuse. You got soldiers, nobles, and rulers interwoven into this new hybrid elite, if you will. This is an empire by marriage. It's empire by mimicry. They are using politics as intimacy, using marriage to fuse empires, which is, of course, a widespread political strategy that is not limited to the ancient world, but we will continue to encounter this even into the 19th and 20th centuries in some regions. But as some of you might have expected by now, this new synthesis doesn't sit easily with everyone. The old Macedonian nobles, man who bled beside Alexander at Granicus and Issus, they see their king wearing these Persian robes, he's speaking Persian titles, he's marrying foreign women, and to many of them this is unsettling. The distance between them and him widens with every triumph. Then in Marakanda, that tension which has been building up explodes. It is the summer of 328 BCE when the king Alexander is drinking deep at a symposium with his officers. One of them is Clytus the Black, the man who once saved Alexander's life at the Granicus, remember? They fought together for so many years, they're practically brothers at that time. But sometimes, as many of us probably have experienced in their own lives, wine makes men say things they shouldn't say. Clytus is half drunk and he starts mocking the king's divine pretensions, says the victories belong to Philip's soldiers, not Alexander's dreams. And Alexander, who's of course also drunk, snaps, and in this case I like Curtius Rufus's account for its rhetorical drama. And Rufus describes the situation something like this, quote, "The banquet began in good humor but ended in blood. As the wine flowed, flatterers began to praise Alexander as the son of Ammon, not Philip. Clytus, drunk and embittered, denounced them as liars. He mocked the king's divine pretensions and reproached him for dishonoring his father's memory. Alexander, maddened, hurled insults back. When Clytus reminded him that he owed his life to the very man he now despised, the king's fury boiled over. He leaped from the couch, called for his guard, and shouted for his arms. The companions blocked the doors, trying to prevent disaster, but Clytus, reckless with drink, began reciting a verse that struck the king like a blow. Through Hellas now rings the cry, a tyrant rules, not a king. At that, Alexander seized a spear from a soldier and drove it through Clytus, who was still speaking. The blood splashed over the table and the wine cups. Then, as if waking from madness, Alexander looked upon the body of his friend and cursed himself, crying that he was the murderer of his own salvation." End quote. Silence. The man who saved his life lies dead at his feet. When the rage fades, grief rushes in. Alexander locks himself away, refuses food, he's weeping all the time, calling Clytus's name, the conqueror of worlds, undone by a moment of fury. Now, we like to imagine heroes are in control, but what if the greatest conqueror in history can't even control himself? What happens when the God King remembers he's still a man? Is it the intoxication of power and maybe also the isolation that comes with it that warps our judgment? Or is it simply a question of fiery temper mixed with alcohol? In Alexander's case, I like to think it's all of these things combined. Eventually, the march goes on. It always goes on. After the revolt ends, another plot surfaces. We see a conspiracy among the royal pages, young aristocrats serving at court. They pity grievances, and they are wounded in their pride. It is small stuff when we look at it, but Alexander seizes the opportunity. And this time the target is Callisthenes, the nephew of Aristotle, the historian who once sang Alexander's praises and later refused to perform proskinesis, the bow, before the god king. Officially, they accuse him of corrupting the pages. Unofficially, it is revenge. He is imprisoned. They torture him, they execute him. And another old friend is gone. Another Greek voice silenced. It is chilling. And it is, of course, coldly calculated. The message, once again, unmistakable. Questioning Alexander is no longer an act of reason. It is blasphemy at this point. Again, it's that tension between power and paranoia, the boundary between ambition and madness that is beginning to blur here with Alexander. Alexander, more and more, seems to be shifting from hero to tyrant. And history teaches us great men rarely fall because someone defeats them. They fall because they become the thing they swore to destroy. And yet, through all of this, the murder, the paranoia, the transformations, the army is still loyal to Alexander. The Macedonians grumble, but they obey. The Persians admire him, and the world keeps bending around his will. And by the time the dust of Sogdiana settles, Alexander stands as an absolute master of the greatest empire the world has ever seen. But there is, however, something hollow behind his triumph, because the further east he marches, the fewer things there are left to conquer, and the more his battles turn inward. The dust of Central Asia still clings to the boots of Alexander's soldiers when he lifts his gaze eastward. Persia is his, Darius is dead. The empire lies open and is obedient to him. But peace is like poison to a man like Alexander. He isn't built to rest, he is built to reach stuff. So the name now pulling at him is older than the wars themselves. It is India. To Greek ears, that sounds mythical, the place where the sun is born. where monsters guard mountains of gold. To the Greeks, India is where the world itself fades into mist. And to cross into India is to walk off the edge of the map, to see if the world has an edge at all. And that's the key, isn't it? What do you do when you've already conquered everything your teachers said existed? I guess you start chasing the things they said that didn't exist. So Alexander's dream is no longer about kings and borders. He dreams about infinity at this point in his life. So in 327 BC/BCE, the preparations begin. He sends envoys to the Indian Rajas, demanding submission, taking hostages. Alexander offers alliances where it suits him. 2 armies move out, one under Hephaestion and Perdiccas, through the Khyber Pass. The other, led by Alexander himself, claws its way through the steep, wild terrain of Nuristan and Swat. The mountains are merciless. The locals, they vanish into their fortresses. Alexander answers with fire and slaughter. And then comes Aornos, a giant rock fortress. Legend says even Heracles couldn't take it. That's all Alexander needs to hear. He must have it, not because it is strategic or anything, but because it's there. Because Heracles is said to have failed, because it is Pothos, once again, the burning need to do the impossible, which won't let him walk past. And when Aornos finally falls, Alexander lifts his arms toward the heavens and says, quote, "See, Father Zeus, see, Heracles, I have done what even you could not." End quote. It's not a battle anymore. This has become a ritual of comparing yourself, the mortal son, daring to measure himself against the gods. Talking about the gods, let's talk about the god of wine. Soon the army reaches the strange city, Nysa. It is where ivy grows. And this is unusual because ivy to this part of Asia is alien. The locals claim Dionysos, the god of wine, planted it himself, that their ancestors marched with the god of wine in ecstasy when he conquered the East long ago. Alexander laughs at this, but he listens. He honors their tale. The soldiers start drinking. They crown themselves with ivy and hold wild Dionysian rites beneath foreign stars. It's eerie. And the farther they go, the more the lines between myth and reality blur. I think we're again seeing a common theme here in history, isn't it? Because how many times do we know of a conqueror who begins to believe his own propaganda? And how many times does history confuse him with a god, right? Happens plenty of times, as far as I know. In spring 326 BC/BCE, they cross the Indus. Taxiles greets Alexander as a friend and ally. He surrenders his city of Taxila, but to the east stands a king who won't bow, and that is Porus, a ruler between the Jhelum and the Chenab. Porus waits behind the swollen Hydaspes River with cavalry, chariots, infantry, and about 200 war elephants. Alexander looks across the floodwaters and grins. The night before battle, lightning cracks over the plain. Under cover of storm and darkness, Alexander leads part of his army 20 kilometers upstream. He crosses the river and he strikes. The battle is chaos incarnate. Elephants crash through the lines. Their tusks are wrapped in bronze, their riders throwing javelins from howdahs high above. Horses panic, men scream. The Macedonian formation ripples, it nearly breaks. But Alexander adapts. He draws Porus's attention to one flank. Then while Porus is distracted, he sends Coenos wheeling behind him. Hypaspists push through the center. The elephants, maddened by wounds, they turn on their own men. And when it ends, the field is nothing but mud and death. Thousands lie trampled. Porus fights to the end, wounded atop his elephant, and when he's captured, Alexander asks, "How should I treat you?" Porus answers simply, "Like a king." Alexander smiles and says something like, "Then that is how I will treat you." He restores Porus to his throne, now as vassal of the king of Asia. Isn't that something? You fight the man, destroy his army, and when he finally stands before you, bleeding but unbroken, you recognize yourself in him. 2 new cities rise from the battlefield, Nicaea, the city of victory, and Bucephala, named for the horse that carried Alexander through every fight since Greece. The great stallion dies there. It is old and exhausted by that time. And if Alexander ever cries for anything, it's probably then. Of course, Alexander doesn't stop there and keeps moving even further east. The monsoon arrives. The Punjab turns to swamp and fever for them. Men march knee-deep in water, swatting clouds of insects. They're cutting paths through the jungle. And then finally, they reach the Hyphasis River. It is the last known river of the map. And beyond it lies rumor. The mighty Ganges, endless kingdoms, armies counted not in thousands, but hundreds of thousands. Alexander burns to go on, of course. He wants to see the ocean again, the true edge of the oikumene, the inhabited world. But the army stops. They've had enough. Coenos speaks for them. Quote, "We have followed you to the ends of the earth. Do not demand that we go beyond the end." End quote. Silence. No one moves. For the first time in his life, Alexander gives an order, and no one obeys. He retreats to his tent for 3 days, unseen. The man who's never been defeated meets his first real loss, the will of his own man. When he finally emerges, he agrees to turn back. And how do you think that feels? You've conquered the world, but not yourself. You've beaten kings and gods. And then you discover your own people have limits you can't command. Before leaving, he builds 12 giant altars, which are said to be taller than towers, as Arian says. Monuments to the gods, to victory, to the dream that dies there on the banks of Hyphasis. They mark not the end of conquest, but the end of possibility. From the Hydaspes, Alexander builds a fleet, 2,000 ships under his childhood friend Nearchus, and the plan here is to sail down the Indus to the sea to see where it meets the ocean. The campaign south is brutal. The Malians resist ferociously. Alexander storms one of their cities, scaling the walls himself, too far ahead of his men, and takes an arrow through the chest. The shaft is said to pierce his lung, and he collapses in a spray of blood. The rumor spreads through the camp that the king is dead, and panic begins to ripple through the ranks until he appears days later, pale, bandaged, standing in a litter to show them that he's alive. The army erupts in cheers, but behind his eyes you can sense it. Something has changed. He is mortal again, and he knows it. He keeps pushing south, founds another Alexandria near modern Hyderabad. Like its Egyptian twin Alexandria, Hyderabad is a port for trade. By 325 BCE, they reach the Indus Delta. The land is dissolving into endless sea and sky, and it is here when Alexander divides his forces. Craterus takes the veterans west through the interior, while he himself marches along the coast with the fleet. He wants to see it, the Okeanos, the encircling sea the Greeks believed bordered the world. When he finally reaches it, the sight leaves the army silent. The tides rise and fall like breathing. To the Greeks, it feels alive, almost divine. Alexander walks to the water's edge, the surf soaking his boots. He sacrifices bulls and golden cups to Poseidon, the god of the sea, letting them sink beneath the waves. Then he sails out until the coastline vanishes. There, surrounded by the endless horizon, he offers one last prayer. Imagine it, the kid who once threw a spear across the Hellespont claiming Asia, now tossing gold into the sea to prove he has reached the end of the world. From one ocean to another, from man to myth, and from the limits of geography to the limits of sanity. And somewhere out there, in the roar of the Okeanos, Alexander finally stands still. For the first time, there is nowhere left to go. The world should be done by now. Alexander has seen the ocean, the rim of creation, and he offered sacrifices to Poseidon at the edge of the world. Any sane man would call that an ending, but Alexander isn't any sane man. So he looks west again toward the heart of his empire and decides he will not simply return, but he wants to discover. If he's going to retrace his steps, he'll do it by carving a new path into history. So he orders the fleet under Nearchus to sail west along the coast, while he himself will lead a land force through the desert, through Gedrosia, the Makran. 60,000 men, pack animals, followers, camp women, servants. It's almost a whole moving city. Now, this isn't just a march, but it is an experiment. It is also a gamble. While Alexander's plan on paper sounds practical, charting a new route from India to Persia, find coastal ports, keep in touch with the fleet by land, there is something that is said to be lurking underneath the desert. And the desert, the Gedrosian desert, has a reputation older than Alexander's empire itself. Even Cyrus the Great failed to cross it. Even Semiramis, the legendary queen of Babylon, lost her army to its heat and thirst. Marching through Gedrosia desert with a full army isn't your average weekend family trip. And what kind of man looks at these stories of ancient kings who have tried this and died and says, let's see if I can do better? In September 325 BCE, the army sets out. The fleet is still anchored behind them. They are waiting for the monsoon to shift. Alexander personally organizes supply stations along the coast, but soon the geography turns against him. The mountains cut them off from the sea, and the fleet disappears beyond the horizon. The heat is infernal, to say the least. Sand dunes are said to have swallowed entire horses, and winds whip up storms that flay skin from bone. Then the rain comes, not the gentle kind of rain, but sudden torrents that will fill dry wadis with raging rivers. Man and animals are swept away. The air smells of salt and rot. Water runs out eventually. They drink whatever they can find. Stagnant pools, mud, or even the blood of camels. The dead are left unburied. There's no strength to dig graves. Picture it. You're one of those soldiers. You have marched across half the known world. Mountains, deserts, jungles, all for this man. And now you're dying of thirst because he wants to prove something to history. The great conqueror becomes a gaunt, desperate man at the head of a ghost army. Alexander shares the suffering, refuses water until his men have some, but that gesture doesn't quench anyone's thirst, does it? By the time they stumble out of the wasteland 2 months later, only 1 in 4 are still alive. From 60,000, maybe 15,000 survive. They reach Pura, the capital of Gedrosia, like shades from Hades, skeletal, sun-blackened, hollow-eyed. No word from the fleet also, no glory, only survival. And yet, they have done what Cyrus and Semiramis could not. The myth has been answered, but if you're Alexander, does that really make it worth it? Thousands dead, but you have beaten some ghosts? I don't know. Anyways, Alexander finally meets Craterus' army again in Carmania, and he decides to rewrite the story. He's trying to turn disaster into theater, so he stages a Dionysian procession. The king rides a chariot adorned with garlands, carrying an altar to the god of wine. He drinks and feasts for 7 days straight with his companions, and we see a continuous symposium rolling across the desert. Behind Alexander, you have to imagine soldiers dressed as satyrs, wagons filled with musicians, drinking contests that are going on, and revelry. And really, the conqueror who marched through hell now presents himself as a new Dionysus, a god of wine returning in triumph from the barbarian East. Again, the symbolism here is unmistakable, as Dionysus too was said to have conquered India and returned to civilization and glory. So Alexander's men see the god king living out this myth. But when we look at this whole thing sober, What is it really that is happening here? Is it a man celebrating survival, or is it a man refusing to face how close he came to annihilation? It's probably a mask, perhaps a way of hiding despair behind the sound of those flutes and laughter and drinking. In reality, Alexander is still alive, and that is probably the only victory left to celebrate. Meanwhile, far from the feasting, Nearchus and the fleet are fighting their own war against wind, hunger, and the sea itself. They hug the barren coastline. They're looking for food and fresh water. Greek seamanship meant for friendly islands and short hops becomes a nightmare against the vast, featureless shores of the Arabian Sea. Sometimes the ships are driven far out to sea, other times they scrape against cliffs, but the expedition makes discoveries that will echo for centuries. The proximity of the Arabian coast to Persia, the narrow strait we now call Hormuz, the realization that the Indian Ocean and Persian Gulf nearly touch. It is indeed a very important geographical revelation. And when the fleet finally reaches the Bay of Harmosia, they are battered but still alive. They make contact with Alexander again in Carmania. The reunion, as anyone would expect, is emotional. Imagine Nearchus, salt-crusted, sunburned, bearded like a castaway, embracing his king. Both men have crossed death and came back. The camp erupts in celebration. They found each other again at the edge of the world, but Alexander doesn't linger. He pushes on through Pasargadae, Persepolis, Susa, retracing the empires he's built, now at its zenith. March 324 BC BCE, the campaign that began with a spear hurled across the Hellespont ends with a map that spans continents. Alexander's empire seems to be complete, right? At least as far as the world allows. So what now? When you've done the impossible, where do you go? When you've seen the edge of the world and survived it, how do you come back and live like a normal person again? When we reflect upon the Gedrosian March, we see that it is more than a disaster. It becomes a mirror that shows us how Alexander has become, which is, of course, a man haunted by the ghosts of long gone heroes and driven not by conquest anymore, but by comparison. Alexander can't stop until he has tested every limit, and this is when history comes into play and usually asks the same cruel question, which is, what happens when you run out of limits? The army limps back from the world's edge, and the king does not sit down. Alexander's court is still a camp, and his throne is still a saddle. In summer 324, he moves through Opis and Mesopotamia to Ecbatana for the winter. In spring 323, he is in Babylon, and he is staging his next leap, which is Arabia. Alexander's reign doesn't reside in marches. Empires hate a vacuum. While the king is beyond the horizon, pieces of the machine try to spin free. Satraps get ideas. Mercenaries in Bactria and Sogdiana think exile means independence. In Carmania and Susa, governors act like kings, and in Babylon, Alexander's childhood friend Harpalus treats the treasury like a private estate, raising troops, burning silver like oil in a lamp. Alexander returns and switches from explorer to executioner. He dissolves mercenary bands and strips rogue satraps, punishes them. He elevates loyalists, Atropates of Media, who puts down a revolt on his own, gets honors. Orxines, a Persian noble accused of desecrating the tomb of Cyrus at Pasargadae, is put to death. Whether guilty or not, the message here is clear. The tomb is restored at once. Alexander puts great value into respecting those Persian traditions. For him, those are much more than just a slogan. He appoints Poikastes satrap. Poikastes is a Macedonian who wears Median dress. He learns Persian, rules by Persian custom. Poikastes' appointment is a clear signal that the empire's language is now plural. Now imagine you're a satrap who stayed loyal while your neighbor played king. Do you imitate the victor's fusion, Persian robes and a Macedonian frame? Or do you bet on old ways and old friends? In Alexander's world, tradition survives only if it kneels to the person who can enforce it. Even Macedonian units feel the lash. The plunderers of shrines and tombs are hunted down. Remember, discipline is royal, not tribal. Harpalus, on the other hand, bolts for Greece with money and men, and he's leaving a trail of scandal behind him. If you want to see the skeleton of Alexander's state, just go to Susa. There he stages a mass wedding. Alexander marries Stateria, who is the daughter of Darius and Parysatis. Hephaestion takes another daughter of Darius, Craterus, marries into Oxyatris's line. Perdiccas weds Atropates' daughter, Ptolemy, Eumenes, Seleucus, Nearchus, names that will redraw the world, tie knots with the Persian nobility. The dowries are paid by the king. It really is a blueprint. Macedonians, Greeks, Persians, ranked, interlaced, loyal not to the state but to the man at the center, who is Alexander, of course. The old Macedonian bond of companions is exported into that Iranian feudal web, if you will. And then he scales it, he legalizes, registers the wives, gifts each couple. Now, with those tens of thousands of marriages, you get the seed corn for a mixed officer corps and also a future recruitment pool, right? With all of this, we gotta ask ourselves, is this the generous empire builder Alexander who's mixing peoples, or is he the micromanager welding pressure points to his person? If your marriage comes with pay chests and marching orders, is that really unity, or is this captivity with jewelry? Meanwhile, the army changes its shape. The Iranian cavalry, once in Persian formations, now fight by Macedonian drill. 30,000 Iranian foot, trained since 327, join as the Epigoni. The old phalanx that crossed the Hellespont as a minority inside the machine that it birthed. Then in summer 324, Opus on the Tigris, Alexander announces honorable discharge for the aged and spent. relief does not come. What really comes is rage. The honorably discharged start to shout, "Dismiss us all then! Go fight with your father, Zeus Ammon!" Alexander vaults down, has 13 ringleaders seized for execution. He speaks hard cutting, recounting his and Philip's gifts, their battles, their victories. Alexander says to the resurgents, "You abandon your greatest commander to the care of conquered barbarians." And he dismisses them all and shuts himself away for 2 days. When the army finally breaks, begging, prostrate, Alexander relents. Only the veterans go under Craterus, and reconciliation becomes a ritual. Greek priests and magi sacrifice together, and everybody is happy again. Again, we must ask the question, how much change can you, a soldier under Alexander, endure before your king becomes a stranger in silk? And at what point does discipline become humiliation and obedience become worship, right? Same season, different stage. At Olympia, a royal decree forces all Greek exiles to be restored to their cities. At face value, what appears to be clemency by Alexander is in fact like a hand grenade in the political machinery of the polis. Because remember, for decades Greece has been running on faction, purge, and exile, which are of course powder kegs that great powers like Greece light when it is convenient. And Philip, Alexander's father, had mastered that game, but Alexander decides that this game is now over. So Athens squirms. In the case of Samos, Athenians planted as so-called klerouks for 40 years must go home. Klerouks meaning Athenian citizens who were granted land in a foreign territory or conquered land. And they all have to go home. Displaced Samians must return, on the other hand. Negotiations stumble, nerves fray, and when Harpalus arrives, he is arrested, but he escapes. And with that, rumors of war form. The message is still clear, however. The Corinthian League's original purpose, the Persian War, is finished in fact and myth. And Alexander is no longer just hegemon, he's lord now. The cities respond like they understand it. Decrees of divine honors multiply, altars, prayers, processions. Again, this isn't a religious awakening or anything. It's much more a political agenda that's asking everyone to honor the living God King. If your city's liberty now survives only by flattery, do you crown a man a god to keep your walls standing? Or do you draw a line and say, I am ready to gamble my children's lives on my definition of freedom? When we go back and look at the Persian royal tent, it has by then become a mobile palace, if you will. Carpets, wails, canopies, outside ranks of Macedonian guards, Persian lancers, even Indian elephants. Muscle and myth all together in one parade. Access is managed, it's ritualized. Inside the royal tent, an elevated throne, and around it, the so-called somatophylakes, the bodyguard companions, the inner ring of trust. While the Greek social aspects braid through all of it, like symposia, theater, and games, the center of the Persian royal court never really fixes. The residence is wherever the king wants it to be. Alexander's residence is wherever his shadow falls, basically. And in that shadow stands Hephaestion. At Susa, he becomes Kiliarch of the bodyguard, the number 2 in Persian terms, an office that codifies what has long been true: the closest friend is the closest power. Then, autumn 324, Hephaestion dies. Alexander's private wound becomes a public ritual. They extinguish the sacred fire, which is a Persian sign of a great king's death. Oracles grant heroic honors. There is funeral games that draw thousands. A colossal pyre is planned in Babylon, tier upon tier. He is buried near Achilles. His office remains vacant. Some emptiness is really not to be filled, right? While many people would agree that this is grief, others suggest that it might just be self-mythology by Alexander again. Or is it both? If your best friend is your right hand and your mirror, who are you when he's gone, right? Where does ambition go when its witness isn't there to see anymore? Even after Hephaestion's death, for Alexander, rest is still treason, which is why the Arabian campaign surges onto the boards. The Arabian campaign, with troops trained for desert war and a massive fleet to push down the Euphrates and go out into the Gulf. Colonists are drafted from Phoenician and Syrian cities to seed ports and routes. This is more than just raid control. This is grand strategy. Secure the raiding frontier, stitch India to Egypt by sea, and turn mythic Arabia into a commercial hinge of the world. The departure from Babylon is imminent, but then fever hits Alexander. At first, Alexander shrugs it off. The attacks repeat. They worsen. He keeps planning, keeps seeing officers, but then can no longer stand and can barely speak. He passes his signet to Perdiccas. The soldiers file by the bed to see him one last time. Alexander slips into silence and dies. Late June 323 BC BCE, not yet 33 years old. Of course, after Alexander's death, there's a lot of rumors going on. Was it poison? Was it fate? A god recalled by the gods? Or was it just the swampy mathematics of Mesopotamian summers, malaria and overuse breaking a body that outran death too many times? And I'm afraid we'll never know, but it doesn't really matter anyways, because the more important question is, now that Alexander has died, at whose command everything had been done, what would become of the empire that had been built entirely around his person? According to Diodorus, Alexander is said to have given the following answer to that question, to the question of whom he would leave his empire to. Quote, "To the strongest, for I foresee that great funeral games will be held in my honor." End quote. And indeed, his friends and companions soon engage in long and bloody struggles. The wars the Diadochi, which ultimately destroyed the unity of the empire that Alexander left behind. The fate of Alexander's body can also serve as a symbol of this, because according to his wish, he was to be buried in the oasis of Siva, a wish characteristic, of course, of his grand gestures, which reveals so much about Alexander, right? But his bodyguard Ptolemy, who made Egypt the core of his rule, seizes the great body and takes it first to Memphis and then to his capital city of Alexandria, where he is laid to rest in part of his palace in a sarcophagus made of alabaster. Now, to wrap this episode up, let's talk a little about Alexander and his reception in history. Because how do you judge a man who tries to raise the sunrise when even his friends can't quite pin him down, right? You've got Nearchus, who sails oceans for him, who watches him bleed and rage and weep, and even Nearchus just shrugs and says, "There's a word for it, pothos, longing, that ache in the chest that won't be reasoned with." Alexander lives in the company of heroes and gods, and not as a spectator. He competes with them, he hunts their footprints, he reenacts their deeds. After Siva, he feels the world tilt, right? If Ammon acknowledges him, if ritual says he's kin to Zeus, then where exactly do human limits live? Opposition here becomes an error. Retreating becomes a sin. He must go to the world's edge because that's where the gods are measured, right? And yet, even in myth-making, this is no berserker, the man who prays like a demigod, plans like an engineer. Alexander follows the best geography available. He coordinates fleets and depots. He turns ritual into logistics and logistics into victory. His moral palette may be ancient: friend, enemy, favor, terror, trophy, ruin, but the execution is very modern, isn't it? We see reconnaissance, timing is important, he knows how to combine arms, and he is very gifted in terms of administrative capabilities. Now, what would you do if you were Alexander, and if you believed that, really believed that the gods had tapped your shoulder? Would you stop at a river, or would you keep walking until the map ran out? We humans, we often like to talk in tides and systems, right? Think economies, demographies, and so on. But I genuinely believe that sometimes a single individual can make a whole lot of difference, right? Think of more recent figures who yank history onto a different track. Alexander is that argument incarnate, right? The individual matters terribly. Of course, admittedly, Alexander starts lucky. He starts loaded, right? His father, Philip, hands him a hardened army, a stable Macedon, a bullied Greece. Persia, of course, is like a giant with bad cartilage in the knees. His troops are freakishly loyal. Truly, Alexander also seems to be blessed by fortune, right? Often enough. But I still believe that most important aspect is still that obsession, that pothos inside of Alexander, that refuses half measures. I think that's also why he rejects Darius's partition. I think that's why he takes Aornos and crosses the Hindu Kush, steps at the Oceanus, and tries to stitch India to Egypt with ships and sand. I think that is what pries open the doors to the Hellenistic world, right? Cities, markets, languages, gods traveling and mixing like never before. A world ends and another world begins. Just like Droysen, who says that Alexander's name closes one epoch and opens another. In the end, what is Alexander in history? To me, he is proof that an individual can make a big difference. Even after Alexander's death, commerce still flows along the channels he gauges. Gods swap names, philosophies migrate, we see scripts, coins, art styles, and medical recipes. And so the final question remains, how should we judge Alexander? Maybe the only honest verdict is uneasy. A man who drags the future forward with one hand and the gallows with the other. Alexander is like a comet that lights the sky and sets forests on fire at the same time. So if history is both torch and tally, Alexander is where the light is brightest and the numbers are worst. And so Alexander stands not quite God, not merely man, at the place where myth shakes hands with paperwork. The spear he throws across the Hellespont keeps flying. The question he leaves us keeps echoing. How far should a world go to make a new one?